Hey, my name's GC. I'm the creator of the Dragon Quest Retrospective Series and of the supercut, and I wanted to let you know what you were getting yourself into. The original Dragon Quest Retrospective video came out in 2015, and while the series is a coverage of the entire Dragon Quest series from 1 through 11, exception of 10 because it's a Japanese exclusive MMO, it also encapsulates my growth as a content creator over the course of 4 years. There's a lot of mistakes, there's a lot of things I get wrong, there's a lot of growing pains, but this retrospective series is something still near and dear to my heart. I hope watching this brings you as much joy as it brought me when I was making it, and to the people that have already seen the Dragon Quest Retrospective Series and are just here to watch the supercut again, I can't thank you enough for the long-term support. It still absolutely floors me that people will leave comments and come back to let me know that they're still watching it so many years later. Now, without any further ado, here is the Dragon Quest Retrospective Series. Enjoy. Before Final Fantasy, there was Dragon Quest, and before Dragon Quest VIII, it's the best one. The best one! There was the original Dragon Quest on the NES, remade for the Game Boy Color later on. The first Dragon Quest is, ironically, the shortest of the series, hypothetically speaking, of course. The Dragon Lord, Draco Lord in the Game Boy Color version, has stolen the Ball of Light and plunged the world into darkness, ending its era of peace.
O hero, descendant of the Great Lotto, please save us from certain disaster and fight the evil Draco Lord and save us. If you do, I'll let you bang my daughter, but you have to find her first, 'cause she got kidnapped by a dragon. Help! Oh God, help! What? Armor? What am I, a fucking charity?
There you go, those are your instructions. You got some pocket change, the torch, the key, buy your own weapons, and do whatever it is you gotta do. Dragon Quest was infamous for not telling you a single thing without making you put an effort into finding out. That whole procedure every RPG player does where they talk to everyone in town for information, that was invented here because it's the only way to know where and what to do without looking up a walkthrough, and even then instructions are never clear. But that was the intent back then. The idea was for you to get lost and explore and then slowly piece together what it is you had to do to beat the game. Or buy the strategy guide for $20. Macrotransactions. You'd eventually come across an unfamiliar piece of terrain and discover an ancient tomb dedicated to your ancestor, and on his grave, more instructions that sort of leave you with more questions than answers, but pushing you forward nonetheless. This is why the grinding in Dragon Quest made sense in context. By the time you were done figuring out what you had to do was on a different continent, you were already super ripped from fighting the monsters in the area and were ready for the stronger enemies over the bridge. The formula wasn't perfect, otherwise we wouldn't have remembered grinding as a problem, and assuming you wanted to play through the game a second time or follow a walkthrough, you would have been severely underleveled against all the bosses when you got to them. Shit, Dragon Lord is still a pain in the ass even if you do grind for a few hours. But he can't win against save states! I was surprised to find that there weren't many staples of the franchise in the first Dragon Quest. Countless enemy designs, music, tiles of pain, weapons that double as usable items in battle are all there, but it's also missing a lot of key things like a bank, and party members, a casino, needing a boat, becoming a giant bird. Oh, and that whole gaining experience points, buying equipment for your character, random battles, you know, stuff that you would expect any turn-based RPG to have. Yeah, this helped make that famous. If you've played an RPG, this game probably did a lot of favors for it. There's also really clever game design I didn't expect to see. Showing you that you can walk around city limits or directing you in dungeons with pictures on the ground, they use a lot of those cues in this game, and it was simple, but very cool when you realized that's what they were doing. Dare I say it, it's goddamn impressive. Which is why they made the sequel. Dragon Quest II was literally a bigger version of Dragon Quest I. The same world, but bigger. The same battles, but bigger. The same massages, but bigger? Bigger soundtracks, bigger towns, bigger dungeons, and a much bigger campaign.
Please forgive me, Your Highness. Please forgive the feelings of a woman not worthy of you.
Felicia, no matter how far apart we are, you will always be in my heart. I will cherish our time together, and perhaps when I've proven myself, I can finally say that I am worthy to love you.
Son! Son! Where's that lousy son of a bitch? Oh! There you are. Some guy named Hargun's killed that king for that kingdom. You know the one. I need you to go kick his ass for me since you're descended from the Great Lotto or whatever. Take this sword and go save the world. An armed guard? What am I, a fucking charity? Get your cousins to help you. I don't care if one of them's been turned into a dog.
It's a small gesture, but that copper sword at the very start of the game sets the right expectation going from the first Dragon Quest to this one. You're going to need this. The combat in Dragon Quest II was more involved than its predecessor. Status ailments were introduced in full force, there were more enemies per battle that showed up in groups that could be targeted with new spells and attacks, and to fight them, a team of heroes, each with their own skill set, and it managed to keep battles just as short as they were in the first game, which is basically mathematically impossible. This was when Dragon Quest really started to gain an identity as well. Slimes have been around since day one, but long-lasting members of the monster family made their debut in Dragon Quest II. Churches became a place to revive dead party members, slot machines could be used to gain special items, and of course, naval travel became a pivotal transition in gameplay. The first few hours of Dragon Quest II play like the first one. You walk across the land, going town to town, trying to find the things you need to move forward. But once you've got your party assembled and think, now all I've got to do is fight the final boss, you hop on a boat, and the actual game you're supposed to be playing opens up to you. And much like that clingy girlfriend from high school, it opens up maybe a little too much. People like to cringe at how crazy Dragon Quest I was with figuring things out. Dragon Quest II dumps you in an ocean and says, hey, in this big-ass world, we've hidden 5 things you need to find to get to the final boss, and we ain't saying shit.
Good luck.
This is an important transition that, to my knowledge, occurs in almost every Dragon Quest game and just about every other RPG you can think of, but it's especially important here because this is when Dragon Quest stops giving a shit about how you live your life. It wipes its hands clean and leaves you to figure things out for yourself. In essence, this is when a Dragon Quest game actually starts. I like to call the length of time it takes to get to this point, time to boat. Dragon Quest II, according to my playtime, has a time to boat of about 4 hours and 20 minutes, don't say it. Dragon Quest II adds a lot to what the first game offered, and something you'll notice is you said it, didn't you? What you'll notice in the following weeks is every Dragon Quest tries to be different from the last, and that is the smoothest way I've ever announced a video series. They all try to be a little different or a little more than their predecessor. Speaking of which, I'm sure some of you are already asking, why aren't I playing the original NES versions of these games? Because they're the inferior version. The original Dragon Quest had a horrible interface and the combat was balanced in such a way that it took ages to grind levels. Grinding slimes could kill you in that game. I repeat, grinding slimes could kill you in that game. It looked worse, it played worse, I liked the music better, but that's because I'm so used to hearing the Game Boy sound chip that the NES sound chip sounded refreshing to me. The only thing the NES releases of these games did better was the field of view, and that's because the Game Boy had a lower resolution and they didn't bother making the sprites smaller to compensate. If anything, the remakes are the only reason these two games still hold up. And I do know that certain features were added into the remakes based off of later Dragon Quest titles. I'm not counting those things among the reasons why. Part of me hopes that the last boss of 2 is easier to beat in the original version though, because it was a nightmare to beat that guy. Woohoo! Now I can talk about Dragon Quest III. But before I do that, there's something I have to do. Considering how limited the ways you could play in Dragon Quest I and II were, Dragon Quest III was quite possibly the most unrestricted game in the series, or at least in the first 4 titles. Something that Dragon Quest III had that no other game in the series has had to this day was the ability to completely customize your party as you see fit from the very beginning of the game. Along with your unique hero class, you could also hire 3 other party members with one of 7 other classes in the game. At any time, switch them out for other party members, and later on be able to change their class to diversify their skill set and stats. Personally, I like the traditional party setup. A female warrior, or as I like to call her, best girl, a female cleric with best name, and a spooky wizard. The combat system in Dragon Quest III was a massive update to the series. Stats like agility and intelligence were added and used to determine things like turn order and spell strength. Party members were now allowed to attack each other, which provided an alternative way to cure status ailments. And the game added a day-night cycle that affected random encounter rates and the strength of monsters in battle. This was also the first Dragon Quest to introduce one of my favorite enemy types: mimics. A carefully placed mimic in this game could wipe the party and make a very impromptu end to your dungeon run, and I love it. And yet again, we got even more monster designs that still persist in the series to this day. It seemed like at this point, Chunsoft and Enix and whoever else was involved in the series realized that if they wanted to make these games longer, there would have to be more in the game than just fighting monsters as you went from point A to B to C to D. Spoilers! Fighting random turn-based battles is fun, but it can get really boring really fast. You need lots of monsters, you need characters with different abilities, you need the treasure chests in the opposite direction of where you're supposed to be going, you need
a computer!
Distractions, and in Dragon Quest III, the 2 biggest distractions are the Monster Arena and the Pachisi board. This is the first time we see the Monster Arena in a Dragon Quest game, and right now it's just a gambling simulator. You put down money on monster fights, and if the monster you pick wins, you get lots of money. It's not very big. Pachisi though. Pachisi's where the money's at. It's centered around these board game tracks that you can send your first party member onto, and you're given a limited amount of dice rolls to make it to the end. It's mostly a game of chance, and you can't play it without a special currency, but trust me, it's awesome. But with all of this new stuff, the class system, the new stats, the new monsters, and huge list of new equipment, being able to change party members, the monster arenas, and the Pachisi boards. With all of these things thrown into the mix, someone must have mentioned at a meeting, how the fuck is anyone supposed to do all of this with our current system? If players wanted to change parties, they would have to backtrack all the way to the first town, and with all the different classes in play and specific equipment for them, they would run out of inventory space within minutes. And so they did 2 things. They made the return spell take the player to any previously visited town they wished, and they added the banks to store gold and items. Why is this important, Grandpa GC? Have you finally gone senile talking about the tiniest of details? Previously, the return spell would only take you to the last town you saved in, and inventory management was a problem because you would have to discard good weapons or armor for key items that were necessary to advance in the game. This was okay in the first 2 games because the emphasis was on the world. The overworld of Dragon Quest I and II was the most interesting thing about those games. Backtracking was a necessary evil that allowed you to discover new places and find new things in a game where little to no direction was given to you. And losing space in your inventory was a pressure mechanic that kept you focused on achieving your goal. Dragon Quest III is the beginning of a shift on emphasis. It's the first game in the series that is less about the world and more focused on what you can do in it. Does that make sense? It's difficult to explain, but the Dragon Quest games I grew up playing presented you with this huge world and then brought you down to focus on the little stories and places inside it. Not only was Dragon Quest III the first Dragon Quest game I ever played, but it's also the first game in the series that started doing this. And most importantly, it was the first time in the series where the story in the game became a little more personalized.
Ortega, you are the best man in my kingdom. It pains me to send you to what could be your death, but no one else stands a chance against Baramos.
Think nothing of it, Your Highness. I will gladly give my life so that my wife and child can live in a world without darkness. Rest assured, Baramos will perish by my hand.
Minister, fetch me my bottle.
My name is Barney, and I'm an alcoholic.
Alright, look, kid, your dad's probably dead, and your mom said you're old enough to go camping, so here's some money. Go get some camping buddies to save us from becoming Demon Chow. Oh, and if you can, find your dad. That bastard took my favorite horse.
In the past, saving the day was your job. You were kind of like a celebrity that got paid to wait for bad stuff to happen and fix it when it did. In Dragon Quest III, you're the B-tier hero, the person they send in when the best they have isn't enough. Most of your adventuring is about following your father's footsteps and figuring out what happened to him and how he got to Baramos' castle. And the guy was a badass. He didn't bother finding the magic key or assembling a party of heroes to help him. The guy just fucking winged it, and every town you visited had some story about Ortega being this monumental specimen of the human species. This entire quest stops being about saving the day and starts to become more about fighting your way out of your father's shadow, which is why everything that gets you the items you need to move forward in the story is tied to creating a legend of your own, including getting a boat. Time to boat in Dragon Quest III is 9 hours and 51 minutes, more than twice the time it took in Dragon Quest II, which is something you should be paying attention to. But instead of being a vortex of progression like the last two games were, this one is fairly straightforward the entire way through. They nearly perfected the NPC hint system in this game because you almost always knew of some new place you had to go. And in addition, the map is pretty familiar. But even in the most remote towns, on the tiniest of islands, does the legend of Ortega persist. So you do something that no one could ever dream of doing. You become a giant bird! Yeah, you thought I was kidding about that giant bird business, but GC never fucks around! Of course, this giant bird is the only way to Baramos' castle, and what better way to pull yourself out of the darkness of your father's shadow than succeeding where he failed, right? So you do the dungeon. You die a bunch of times because Dragon Quest and ridiculous spikes in enemy levels, and you finally kill Baramos. Your party is healed, you make your way back home, and you feel accomplished. Like in every Dragon Quest, the game ends with an arrangement of trumpets. Oh no! Tony the Tiger, what do we do? You're not the only one trying to fight their way out of someone else's shadow. Dragon Quest III was upping the ante in every possible place it could. It wasn't just trying to add more, it was trying to be extremely better than its predecessors, so much so that they couldn't fit all the features they wanted into the original release. So of course, at just about the same time it took for you to finish Dragon Quest II, the third act of Dragon Quest III begins with the introduction of Zoma, the Demon King of Darkness, ruler of Baramos, the Demon Lord of Darkness. At the very least, you're setting out knowing that you've done what your father couldn't, right? Wrong. As you soon find out, Ortega didn't die fighting Baramos. He fell into the world below and set out to destroy Zoma. How do you find out? Because that's where you go. To the world of darkness. Funny how just when you realize that you haven't really left your father's shadow, you're literally thrown into a world perpetually covered in it. Although there's definitely something oddly familiar about this place, isn't there? Yeah, Chunsoft really wanted you to shit your pants when you finally reached this point of the game. Not only is the game not over, you're also going back to the world of Dragon Quest I and II. The third act doesn't take long and your party is leveled adequately enough by now that they can handle anything, though that doesn't mean you can just waltz through the rest of the game. Dragon Quest III was balanced enough that you didn't need to grind levels, but it still offered a suitable degree of challenge. It had some shenanigans though, like sea slimes. They're resistant to magic, they have high defense, they cast defensive spells, they're fast, it's a mess. Screw you, sea slime. And of course, every boss fight is completely blown out of proportion in terms of what the boss can do. Hey, real talk? If there isn't a way to boost magic resistance, maybe we shouldn't give the boss like 1,000 different magic missile spells, eh? I mean, it's bad enough that the final boss has 2 turns every round and can double hit my characters to kill them, but then you gotta throw in the ice breath that I can't reflect or defend against, and I feel like a fucking target dummy for the king of the underworld. Before fighting Zoma, you do find out what happened to Ortega, but I'm not going to spoil it because it's quite emotional. After beating Zoma, light dawns on the world of darkness, and a massive earthquake closes off access to the world above. There's only one king around, so that's who you go talk to. You arrive at the castle, inform the king of your success, and he grants you the title of Lotto. That's right, Dragon Quest III is the origin story of Dragon Quest I. Do you know what the subtitle for Dragon Quest III is? The Seeds of Salvation.
It's such a good title!
Credits roll, anyone who's played the last 2 games loses their mind, you realize that you created a legend that's remembered for hundreds of years, and the credits end with the words, "To be continued in Dragon Quest I and II. Fucking classy. I originally intended to talk about the first 3 Dragon Quest games in one episode. To me, these 3 games together are the foundation this series builds on top of. It's very difficult to look at Dragon Quest I on its own because it's very rough and not well constructed, and Dragon Quest II is a more refined example of what 1 was trying to do. But Dragon Quest III is when all the pieces clicked and was the first time the series felt whole. Still, I couldn't just do Dragon Quest III without mentioning 1 and 2 because without 1 and 2 there would be no 3.
But wait, there's more. In Dragon Quest IV.
Have I mentioned how every Dragon Quest game tries to set itself apart from the others? Well, they do, in case I forgot to mention, they do, and Dragon Quest IV was no exception to this rule. But obviously that's not the only thing they did, otherwise this wouldn't be a series and would be more of a loosely threaded excuse to create a brand, and okay, to a certain extent that's exactly what it is. But after the Lotto trilogy ended on such a high note, you'd have to be an idiot not to put that thing under a magnifying glass and take the strongest elements it had and find a way to make it even better. With Dragon Quest IV, Chunsoft not only needed to identify what was great about the original trilogy and base their next game around that, but it also needed to provide a game that could compete with its massively successful predecessor. Dragon Quest III was so good that students got arrested for skipping class when it came out. And that's t-shirt worthy. How can you possibly compete with that? With the series picking up steam at this point, it was only natural for Dragon Quest IV to begin with a rolling start. Instead of putting you in the shoes of the main character right away, the game was split into 5 chapters, and the first 4 chapters served a ton of different purposes. Each chapter details the lives of 7 different characters, this is clear as day, but underneath those stories, Dragon Quest IV is introducing new players who hopped on the hype train after Dragon Quest III to the series, and presenting the new ideas it wanted to contribute to the franchise. Chapter 1 details the adventure of Ragnar McRyan, a knight working for the King of Burland. Ragnar McRyan's chapter was reminiscent of Dragon Quest I. It's a single character carrying out a fairly straightforward mission without anything in between. On a gameplay level, it was as basic as a Dragon Quest game can get. In the first dungeon you traverse, a mysterious voice leads you in the right direction and tells you when you're going the wrong way, effectively holding your hand through the whole thing. And after getting to the end of the main path, you're made aware that there's something else calling you in the dungeon, which then persuades you to explore around without a guide to help you navigate. And doing that will get you Healy the Heal Slime, a party member that you can't control but will automatically heal you when your health gets too low. Chapter 1 is only an hour long, but by the end of it, you understand the fundamentals of the game. If Chapter 1 is Dragon Quest I, then Chapter 2 is its sequel. 3 party members in the form of a warrior, cleric, and wizard in that exact order, a bigger piece of the world very close to where we just finished playing in Chapter 1, a needy wizard class that needs to get babysat by the cleric to survive intense battles. Sounds like Dragon Quest II to me. Notice the subtle changes from Chapter 1 to Chapter 2 here. Healing is no longer automated for you, you now have more than one controllable party member, and you now have access to a variety of offensive and defensive magic spells. Now, the game is a little more complex than it was 10 minutes ago. On top of that, this adventure is no longer entirely straightforward anymore, and this is when Dragon Quest IV introduced two of the most iconic staples of the series. While you were busy learning enemy resistances and how to properly use your two new party members, you'd no doubt come across maybe my favorite item in the Dragon Quest series: mini medals. Small collectible medals scattered around the world's nooks and crannies that when turned in can yield amazing equipment for your party members. In their original form, mini medals were a currency used to purchase these amazing items, and you were allowed to purchase the same item more than once. When he introduced them to the series, Yuji Horii, esteemed creator of Dragon Quest, said he wanted to have something in the game that the player could collect, which is why in previous games you collected orbs and other key items. But he didn't want a collectible item that was tied into game progression, so he made the medals as a way to satisfy that want and still reward the player for doing so. Not only were they an incentive for players to further go out of their way in dungeons, but they were a much more enticing reward for the player when it came time to search the towns for items. After all, finding enough medals to buy a hat that slowly regenerates magic points was way better than finding a pot lid inside a dresser that takes up inventory space and was worth about as much as a pot lid can go for, which is not a lot. The search for these medals facilitated all the other information gathering aspects of Dragon Quest I've talked about in previous episodes as well. The second staple Dragon Quest IV established was the casino. It took the slot machines and the monster arena, put them together under one roof, and then added a blackjack poker game. It also didn't use gold as currency, but rather required you to buy casino tokens in order to play. You could then exchange casino tokens for incredibly strong items that would last you the entire game. This is actually a fairly competent parallel to the way gambling works in Japan. It's not illegal if you're not using money to play. While the mini medals encouraged progression and exploration, the casino was the antithesis to that. Its purpose was to stop you from moving forward and keep you preoccupied from the rest of the game without forgetting that it was still part of the game itself. On my first run of Dragon Quest IV, I spent time in the casino because I really wanted that pretty spangled dress. Not because I'd look good in it, just between you and me though, I can rock that look every day of the week, but because I figured out that it was the best piece of armor for Elena, the female warrior in my party. Goes without saying, but that kind of practicality is part of what makes side activities in games like this so good. Chapter 3 was essentially one big side activity made into a core segment in the game. Meet Torneko Taloon, aspiring merchant and big dreamer. Taloon dreams of someday owning a shop of his own. So, how much time do you got? The first thing you did in Chapter 3 was head on over to your workplace and play as a shopkeep. People came in and you assisted them in buying and selling, and you got paid a commission for however many sales you made that day. You could even turn people away if you wanted, and items you purchased from customers went up on sale right away and you could make a profit off it and everything. If you stuck around long enough, your boss would send you home, day would turn to night, and you'd go to bed, wake up, and do it all over again. And you could do this forever. For the rest of your time playing Dragon Quest IV, if you wanted to work as a clerk at a shitty store, you could. But eventually, you'd have to put your foot down and refuse to postpone your dreams any longer. You'd have to forcibly break out of the monotony the game had presented you and go out exploring. When you did open the shop you've always wanted to have, you could actually put stuff in your inventory up for sale, and at the end of every day, your wife would give you the profits the store made that day. Torneko Taloon is a cool guy, man. His chapter is unique to the mainline series entirely. There's nothing else like it. But it also shows the player what kind of game Dragon Quest is. Nothing is forcing you to move forward. There are no directions, there are no lines to follow, there is no marker on your map telling you... That one doesn't count. The fourth chapter was about the twins, Mina and Maya, and honestly threw me for a loop. I kept dying because Mina and Maya aren't as strong as Ragnar or Elena and couldn't take hits at the front of the party. At one point, I got fed up and I started whining. They're too weak, they can't sustain damage, they play like support characters. Wait. Oh. Party lineup is important, as well as knowing how to properly use support characters, and that's what Chapter 4 was trying to teach me. And there's proof that the lesson works. On my second time playing through Chapter 4, I immediately moved the sisters to the back end of the group and didn't die once. I even beat the boss at a lower level and less equipped than I was the first time around. I've been going on about these first 4 chapters, and I know I sound pretentious talking about them like this, but you gotta understand, no other Dragon Quest had ever done this before. Dragon Quest III might have added some complexity to the combat system, but it never expounded on it, and the other 2 games never bothered to explain anything at all. But here comes Dragon Quest IV with some of the best pacing, both narratively and ludologically, that the series has. Is ludologically a word? I hope it is. It didn't really hit you until you started playing Chapter 5, when you finally took control of your main character and quickly collected all the party members you had already previously played as into one big super group. Because of the first 4 chapters, you already knew who these characters were and what their motivation was. You knew their backstories, their personalities, next of kin even. You knew main villains that still needed to be taken care of and important problems that hadn't been solved, so you already had a rough idea of what you needed to do and where you needed to go. And to wrap it up in a nice bow, you already had a complete understanding of how to play the game and handle the 8 different party members you had at your disposal. Whether you realized it or not, you had just played through one of the most well-disguised and longest tutorials in a video game, and to congratulate you on your achievement, the game gave you free reign to go wherever you pleased. Time to boat in Dragon Quest IV is about 7 to 10 hours depending on your own playstyle, and marks the halfway point in the game. Notice that the time to boat in Dragon Quest IV wasn't much longer and could have been shorter than it was in Dragon Quest III. Chunsoft, being the intelligent craftsmen that they are, was still working on emphasizing content over scale. Dragon Quest IV didn't have any long periods of figuring out what to do next. There was a much more natural sense of direction this time around, and by Chapter 5, the world map had been more or less completely explored. Despite that though, there was still so much you could do in the places you'd been to. Parts originally inaccessible, character subplots that advanced due to the passing of time, wedding ceremonies that loop perpetually and will forever trap those participating. These places felt alive and warranted a second visit, and the game naturally guided you towards them. In fact, this was such a good use of world space that it got rid of the one major problem that has always plagued the series. With players always knowing where to go and what to do, there was no longer a need to apply gross level gaps between areas because you were no longer inadvertently grinding while getting lost every 2 hours. The 8 different party members at your disposal encompassed every class and every possible spell or ability that you could have possibly had in Dragon Quest III. And unlike that game, you could switch party members in and out of your active lineup in the middle of battle thanks to the wagon system Dragon Quest IV also introduced. So obviously, with a full arsenal of skills that could be mixed and matched together to form multiple combinations of parties that had their own strengths and weaknesses in combat, it was no longer about being stronger than your opponent, but smarter. This gelled excellently with all the time you had already spent learning each character's strengths, because figuring out the appropriate combination of party members to beat a certain boss was all you had to do to beat it. And that's not a bad thing. Figuring out what party setup works best for you against a particular boss is not as easy as it sounds. And this final boss, let me tell you about this final boss, because this final boss, this final boss. The final boss fight of Dragon Quest IV is amazing. It has 7 forms, and each form has a different moveset and a different pattern that you have to address differently. And this isn't 7 forms all split within cutscenes. No. This is just one giant boss fight that you have to fight all over again if your party wipes. This boss starts losing body parts and then grows a face in his stomach, and then he regrows those body parts, and then he grows a second face, and if you don't know which party member is needed to prevent each form from stomping you into the ground, then you are fucked. For a game that's done nothing but teach you how to efficiently utilize the tools in your hands, this is the ultimate challenge, and it is as visually appealing as it is mentally. Granted, it probably didn't look as cool in the original, so you have Heartsoft to thank for the PlayStation remake and the update to the graphics. You also couldn't directly control party members aside from the main character, and switching party members out in battle costed you a turn, so the combat might not have been as engaging in the original either. But this is just further proof that the remakes of these games are better in almost every way, and playing the original is kind of like a modern doctor using leeches. And Dragon Quest IV represents that idea wonderfully. Not only does it make the original trilogy feel obsolete, but it's also addressing the series' weaknesses as well. Its main strength is that it doesn't have any of Dragon Quest's weaknesses. It isn't super long, it isn't super grindy, it tells a good story with memorable characters, but it doesn't sacrifice any of Dragon Quest's strengths to do so. If the first 3 Dragon Quest games are the foundation, then Dragon Quest IV is the first layer of concrete that sits on top of it. I don't know how construction works, in case you can't tell. It is, without a doubt, an improvement that set the bar for the series ever higher. Don't cry. It's Dragon Quest V. The Dragon Quest series has been around since the 80s, but it's changed hands multiple times over the years. Yuji Horii has always been the lead designer and writer for the series since the beginning, and Akira Toriyama and Koichi Sugiyama still handle the artwork and music respectively, but even they must know that every team that has ever worked on Dragon Quest has left their mark in some way, shape, or fashion. The most influential of them being, of course, Chunsoft, the developer that helped start it all, and the developer that left the series after releasing Dragon Quest V. It was their last game before Heartbeat took over the series 3 years later. Granted, it probably didn't look as cool in the original, so you have Heartsoft to thank for the PlayStation remake and the update to the graphics. No, Heartbeat. What kind of moron would get those names mixed up like that? A fucking idiot? Stupid. Dragon Quest V is often cited as Mr. Horii's favorite, and it's easy to see why. There's a lot to cover in this one, and I'm not going to be able to touch on everything, so let's start with the game's strongest quality. Similar to the chapter system we had in Dragon Quest IV, 5 was split into 3 periods of the main character's life, starting in childhood.
You know, son, you really shouldn't be in bed for so long when you're out at sea. We wouldn't want you to get sheet sick.
Fuck off, Dad. In Dragon Quest III, it was all about you and your dad. In Dragon Quest IV, it was about learning where you came from and the people who were close to you. And again, in Dragon Quest V, we have a story that begins with the father and son, but eventually extends into really what I feel is the strongest core theme of this series as established by Dragon Quest V. Dragon Quest stories are about family. Whether it's the family you're born into, the family you find, or the family you create, and a bunch of other possible things having to do with family. This series has always been about the intimate bonds of family.
Oh boy, looks like we're staying in this town a little longer while I deal with this fever. Maybe you should go play outside. Ah, shit. Oh, sorry son, didn't mean to be such a hothead.
As a child, you didn't really get to be on your own until your dad got preoccupied with something else. Otherwise, you were attached to the hip, unable to go where you pleased, and your dad constantly healed you after every battle. It made for a good tutorial, sure, but it was about as frustrating as that kind of childhood would actually be, and it got more frustrating once you were doing the RPG thing on your own. I praised Dragon Quest IV for being a well-balanced RPG at a time when that wasn't common. Dragon Quest V was not, but for a really, really good reason. Remember the big deal I kept making about all these different monster designs and how cool they are and how they're basically mascots for the series? Well, I don't know, you're a smart person, you got brains, you went to school, you grew up on the Itadaki streets. You tell me, before Yokai Watch, before Digimon, before Pokemon, Dragon Quest V introduced monster taming, and for the first time ever, and yes, I know I sound like a broken record at this point, you could recruit monsters as party members, each with their own skills, stats, and artwork. When you've only got access to a static party, it's possible to balance an entire game based around multiple combinations of that party. When 8 possible party members turns into 40 recruitable monsters, multiple recurring characters that leave and come back into the party later, and extra recruitable party members that have nothing to do with anything, it's sort of hard to balance an RPG around that many variables. Where Dragon Quest IV excelled in balance and pacing, Dragon Quest V excels in variety and convenience. You had a lot of options, but as a result, you were more likely to hit progression walls if your party wasn't up to snuff in time. But why did they even introduce monster taming in the first place? Because it's cool. You tamed your first monster as part of the story, but it's a short-lived moment because one dungeon after that, your childhood is put to an abrupt end.
Well, son, I guess this is it.
Yes, say the last words you humans love to impart so greatly.
Oh man, I always knew I'd die in a dungeon, but I always thought it'd be a much more entertaining one, like a fungin.
Is this guy for real?
Quite appropriate that the childhood portion of the game ended at the same moment your childhood innocence was lost. Jokes aside, adventuring with your dad was kind of heartwarming, but his death was expected considering the series we're playing has issues with keeping parents alive. Seriously, we're like 4 for 4 on that. Monster taming wasn't the only big thing they added to the series in this installment. This was the first Dragon Quest game to be made for the Super Nintendo, so with the better hardware behind them, Chunsoft was able to add a lot of new things. My favorite were the new weapon types, boomerangs and whips. Both these items could attack every monster in battle or any monster group respectively, and they changed how non-magic combat worked ever so slightly. Magicless characters now had a second option to switch over to in battle in order to hit multiple targets. This made playing without using magic spells more versatile and a little less repetitive, as there was now a reason to stop and think about which weapon would best serve the situation. And whips were equipable by dominant magic casters, so that gave them an attack to fall back on if they ran out of magic points to cast spells. But even that paled in comparison to the other vast improvements made in this game. There were so many, in fact, that it'll be easier to list them all in a little segment I'm going to call That Was New? Let's start with an important one. The bag makes its first appearance, providing unlimited inventory space and removing the necessity of item vaults from the game. Players no longer have to return to towns when their inventory gets full.
Fascinating.
The reason this is useful is because for the first time in the series, pots, barrels, and other similar containers can be searched for items, so inventory fills up much faster. To help facilitate this new feature, you now only have to push a single button to use the search, examine, and talk actions, which were previously only doable by going to a menu first.
Oh my god.
Speaking of menus, the shop menu now shows information on what stats will change if you were to equip the selected item in stock and which party members can equip it. Purchasing items for your characters will now give you the option to equip it automatically, as opposed to backing out of one menu to navigate another in order to equip it.
I can't believe it!
There is now an actual defense stat in the game that can be made stronger by equipping armor and gaining levels. Previously, defense was a calculated stat based off of other stats in the game, and better armor didn't necessarily mean better defense.
That doesn't make sense.
Changed back from Dragon Quest IV, you can freely control other party members in battle again, and should you decide to use the tactical options instead, the AI has been vastly improved to better serve your needs. It no longer takes up a turn to swap party members out in battle for another waiting in the wagon, and you can now switch everyone out at once if you wanted to.
You lie! You're a fucking liar!
And just as important as the first edition, for the first time in the Dragon Quest series, any party member targeting an already dead monster will have their target switched automatically to another monster. Before this was added, characters doing this would waste their turn if a monster died mid-round to someone else. And all of that was new.
Wow.
If anyone wants to argue why the originals are still worth playing, now is the time. Please, enlighten us. The training wheels came off once you entered the adult act of the game. It was time for you to strike it out on your own and continue your father's quest. For a time, all you could do was revisit old towns and go to places you hadn't been to on the continent you were stranded on. If you played your cards right though, you might have found yourself with more than just the means off land. Time to boat in Dragon Quest V was about 10 hours, but along with this beautiful, majestic symbol of romance dawn, you were also in the company of some lady you had to pick out of the lineup to be your wife or something, whatever. Waifu selection was actually significant to gameplay because each potential waifu had different kinds of stats that could drastically change how you assembled your party. Your wife would accompany you on your quest, and your various adventures together were a form of honeymoon, much like this segment of the game being the honeymoon period of your experience. Finally free to explore the world, trade in those hard-earned mini-medals, take the missus to the casino, and trek through dangerous caverns full of ravenous creatures hell-bent on tearing the skin off your flesh and using your eyeballs as marbles. A romantic getaway for two. Dungeons in Dragon Quest V were a lot more involved than in previous games. By that I mean they weren't just basements with really bad structural integrity. Branching hallways and looping corridors is all fine and good, but it was about time for something more interesting. People weren't falling for the old gimmicks anymore. There are only so many times you can fool someone by putting the right staircase on the farthest end of the floor. This game had some of the earliest examples of what are now traditional dungeon concepts. Sliding ice floor puzzles, and minecart riding for one, and more all-around complexity with layouts. There was a dungeon towards the end of the game that played around with multiple layers on the same floor too. These dungeons themselves became a feature, a puzzle if you will, that genuinely felt good to figure out. And because a big part of these games for some people was to leave dungeons to heal and come back, it relied on the player actually figuring things out in order to be able to navigate the dungeon multiple times. The Dragon Quest games never deviated too much from core gameplay mechanics, but they've always tried to build on those fundamentals, and these experimental dungeons with the monster taming changed up a lot of the usual players came to expect. And there's a mimic dungeon in this one! That's awesome! Think about it. Players are always going out of their way to open treasure chests in these places, so why not make a dungeon that capitalizes on that mindset? They also made a new mimic type that hide out as pots in all the towns you can explore, which makes exploring cities a little more exciting. Hey babe. Hey, check it out. He's a pothead. Nah. I've made a mistake. It's during the adulthood segment of the game that the story started to grip you. The characters were memorable, and not because you knew them like you did in Dragon Quest IV, but because you sympathized with them. This is largely in credit of the story spanning 20 years of our protagonist's life, so the events that occurred had lasting impressions on these people. And because of the passing of time, there was actual character growth that could be witnessed in the dialogue exchanged between you and other characters. Look no further than Sancho, your father's assistant that was with him when your mother first disappeared.
You are starting to look like your madre. Mada, she was such a kind and beautiful señora. No, Sancho, he no gonna let the same thing happen. Wake up everyone who is sleeping in the castle. We gonna save your wife, friend. We gonna rescue Bianca.
See, I am old these days, but the young ones, they no beat me. No, senor. Being able to talk to the people in your party with a single button press, something that the remakes probably added, made this all the more effective. And there were good moments in this game that actually solicited an outward emotional response from me. For a series that tended to follow a certain narrative trend, Dragon Quest V broke that mold and delivered a strong character-driven story that I don't want to give away entirely because I think it's worth experiencing for yourself, especially the parenthood segment of the game.
You know, son, the first adventure your mother and I ever went on was in a haunted house. You could say it was love at first fright.
I can't believe you just said that. Everything in consideration, Dragon Quest V was an appropriate farewell from Chunsoft and easily a top 3 contender in the series. It definitely had a slow start, and it slightly leaned the series back into grinding territory because of balancing issues, but it does so with a purpose. The features it added and the improvements to the features that already existed easily make it the best of the 5 Chunsoft worked on. And taking into account all the quality of life things they changed as well, it establishes the template for modern Dragon Quest games, which I think was Chunsoft's way of passing the torch to Heartbeat. Oh boy, this is gonna be tough. Dragon Quest games have a very simple formula hard set in old school RPG values. Yeah, they try something new with each game they make, but the last word anyone would use to describe Dragon Quest with is complicated. And you know what? It's the simplicity of these games that make them so popular. Anyone can pick it up and play it. Unless we're talking about Dragon Quest VI. Dragon Quest VI is complicated and not in a good way. The game starts like any other Dragon Quest VI is a huge callback to... So there's a lot of additions in this one that, Guys, let me level with you. I've been tearing sheets out of this notebook for over 2 days trying to figure out how to write this episode, and I can't. Reason being that this game's problems apply a form of circular logic in order to justify themselves, which makes it very difficult for me to choose what to begin with. The rest of this episode is being written as a stream of consciousness, and if you can't keep up with me or get confused, it's okay. That's exactly what playing Dragon Quest VI is like. I don't think this game is on par with Dragon Quest standards, but even so, it still made some very important contributions that we need to cover. You might have noticed that the monster arena hasn't gotten much play since I mentioned it in Dragon Quest III. It didn't change at all in Dragon Quest IV, and it was totally absent from Dragon Quest V. I guess Chunsoft had finally realized that you could save scum casino tokens using it. But Heartbeat decided the monster arena deserved a fresh new face. It became the slime arena, and you couldn't place bets on monsters anymore, but you could enter your own slime type monsters into battle and earn prizes for winning. Now, in the original Dragon Quest VI, they lowered the amount of tameable monsters from 40 in Dragon Quest V to 18, and you could only tame a total of 15 at a time. In the DS remake, they realized it wasn't worth having it in its current state and removed monster taming altogether, replacing it with being able to recruit NPC slime monsters you met in towns and dungeons. When you entered a slime in the arena, you would pick a rank to enter, and your slime would fight the battles on its own as an AI. If it won, you'd earn a special reward. This is a significant change that a special game will use effectively in the future. If you had annotations on in the Dragon Quest V video, you would know that I fucked up and incorrectly said that the bag was introduced there. I was wrong. Heartbeat made the bag in Dragon Quest VI. Unlimited inventory space meant no need for item vaults, but there was a need to store money away, so item vaults became banks. To make navigation faster, the party now moved twice as fast in towns and dungeons than they did in the overworld. In addition, wells could now be looked into and explored in, and there were specific well monsters that could attack you inside them. Doors now opened automatically if the player ran into them and had the appropriate key. I know this should have been a That Was New segment, I just couldn't find enough reaction clips.
Disappointed!
And they also introduced a new stat called Charisma, but it's not important because it sucks. Your weapons and armor would change your charisma like fashion points, and it sucks. You only needed this stat for one part of the game, and it's just a matter of having enough points in it to win a contest for a key item you need to beat the game, and it sucks. What didn't suck was how mini-medals worked in Dragon Quest VI. Now previously, mini-medals were a currency that you spent for powerful items. In Dragon Quest VI, they were changed into static collectibles. Collect a certain amount of mini-medals and the mini-medal king would bestow upon you a special item. Instead of a shop system, it worked more like getting rewards for hitting certain milestones. This is how the modern mini-medal system works, unless we're talking about Dragon Quest IX, which brings the old system back. Instead of buying multiples of the same item, or only being able to ultimately own one of each mini-medal reward of the 6 available to you, this new system expanded the amount of rewards you got. And because you could get more rewards sooner, the relevancy of mini-medals stayed a lot stronger throughout the whole game. You didn't have to save up your mini-medals anymore. As soon as you had enough for the next milestone, you could take advantage of a cool new item. That should cover the important stuff, but if I forgot something, I'm sorry. There's a lot of games and I'm using all these wiki pages and they all look the same, so sometimes I read the wrong one and I'm only human and it's very confusing. Incredibly not confusing was the return of the job system, or as they were called in this game, vocations. Each character in your party could take on a vocation, and that's how they earned spells and abilities. Winning battles under a vocation would increase your mastery in it, and mastering certain vocations was needed to take on more advanced vocations with stronger abilities. Switching vocations didn't reset your progress in any of them, and you could preview what you would learn under that vocation. You couldn't make your own characters like you could in Dragon Quest III, but your roster was big enough for each member to take one of each basic vocation to start. It was a clever expansion to a system we hadn't seen in a long time. The previous job system was very basic, and you'd typically only change a party's classes once or twice. Having an advanced vocation to build towards provided a sense of direction where there originally wasn't any, and knowing what vocation gave which abilities helped you form an idea of what you wanted your party to look like. And you'd be seeing a lot of use out of this job system too, because the random battle rates were increased to speed up vocation mastery. And here's the problem with kicking up the random battle rate in Dragon Quest. The combat is not that fun. Now, I'm not saying it wasn't fun to fight monsters in previous games. It's just that combat in Dragon Quest has a certain repetition to it that becomes very tedious if the time between two battles is too short. This is a problem that the original versions of these games had. Dragon Quest IV, the most balanced of the remade titles, had this problem in spades in the original release. Maybe back in the day this was okay because it was what people expected. We didn't have many other examples of random battles in other RPGs, but when every other remade title fixed this issue, why didn't Dragon Quest VI? Well, because the job system needed battles as points for progression. Of course, I could be talking crazy and it could have just felt like there were more battles because of how poor the enemy design was in Dragon Quest VI. None of the actual art was bad, though I do have some reservations, but the actual number of enemies in this game, both new and old, was staggeringly low. For example, this gargoyle enemy is an early boss that gets reused as a regular enemy early on. There's nothing wrong with that, until that same gargoyle enemy persists to show up in every battle for the next 10 hours. Imagine if you were playing Pokemon, and for the next 5 cities over, every trainer you battled had a Caterpie. You would be fucking sick of fighting Caterpie. You would petition to get Caterpie removed from future Pokemon games. The difference between Pokemon and Dragon Quest is in Pokemon, they can't paint Caterpie blue, call it Bluterpie, and make you keep fighting those for the rest of the game. This was done over and over in Dragon Quest VI with multiple enemies. I don't have a problem with recoloring enemies to make stronger variants, but there needs to be a rest period, otherwise the player is going to react to random battles negatively. I swear to God, if I have to fight Lexington one more time, oh God, there's 2 of them! Now compound this issue with yet another facet of Dragon Quest VI that wasn't up to par with its predecessors. Dragon Quest V breathed life into dungeoneering with clever ideas to encourage active participation from the player. There was a trick to getting through each dungeon, and all the dungeons were concise and not any bigger than they needed to be. A perfect example of intelligently using space. Not only were there no clever gimmicks of any kind to any of the dungeons in Dragon Quest VI, but the dungeons themselves were massive. The mechanics in these dungeons didn't take thought, but rather time. Push this switch, so you can push this switch, so you can push this one right here, so that the staircase opens up. And I walked down this really long way. Oh fuck. Compare this static series of events to figuring out how to set up a track in such a way that a minecart will move along the desired route. Do you see the difference here? The difference between forcing the player to take an action and forcing the player to consider multiple actions. One is fulfilling, entertaining even. The other is only there to extend time. Dragon Quest IV didn't have the kind of dungeons that V had, but it didn't waste your time with long hallways and multiple floors. Long hallways and multiple floors meant to provide more random battles to push you further along your vocations. Because although the vocation system was this game's greatest strength, it was so catered to that everything else suffered for it. Why do I have to fight so much? Well, because if you didn't, you wouldn't get enough vocation masteries. Why are the dungeons so long? So that you can fight a lot. Why do I need so many battles to level up vocations? Because if you didn't, you wouldn't have anything to do in the long-ass dungeons. And that is the circle of logic I mentioned earlier. To improve the gameplay, all that needed doing was a tweak to the number of battles one would need to master vocations and the truncation of these dungeons. But because one feature's condition was being used to justify the other, it seemed like it made perfect sense as it was. But that's only when you ignore possibilities that break that convenience the circle provides. And most disappointing of all, this turned every dungeon into a buffer for a boss battle against an otherwise unworthy opponent. If you were smart enough to leave the dungeon to heal, come back and make a beeline to the boss, then you would have beaten every boss handily. The question was no longer, do you have the abilities to feasibly win this fight? It was now, how much HP and MP do you still have left after walking through that big-ass dungeon? The one bastion of challenge, or change of pace even, in Dragon Quest was gone, and they had the added audacity to recolor a normal enemy and turn that into a boss fight. And something really mind-boggling? They removed the ability to swap out active party members from the wagon in dungeons too.
You seem like a sensible human being. Who does that?
I'd say that I spent about 70% of my game time in dungeons, so without the option to change my lineup, half of the actual party was unusable during that time. This especially didn't make sense because you could still cast spells with these wagon characters inside of the dungeon even though you couldn't use them in battle. So what, is it like an amusement park ride? The trolley only sits 4, but your friends can ride in the trolley behind yours or something? Come to think of it, Dragon Quest VI does feel like a theme park ride. Everything's more or less on a track, there's a ton of animatronics that pop out every few seconds, and if you decide to get off the ride at any point in time, you'll be completely lost in the dark because all the lights will be off. In another callback to Dragon Quest III, there are 2, technically 3, worlds in Dragon Quest VI, the physical world and the dream world being the 2 major locations you played in. The physical world is noticeably darker, while the dream world, the world everyone goes to when they dream, has paler tones to represent the fog-like vision one would have in a dream, or something like that. These worlds shared lots of things. Obviously, any character you met in the physical world had their dream counterpart that represented some kind of facet of themselves. I'll get to that in a second. Every town had a dream counterpart too, and yeah, you did get the impression that this was a cheap way of reusing the same locations twice, but the differences between the town counterparts and those of the people living in them provided more details that ultimately made these places more interesting. But I'm sure the difference you're most interested in is either world's modes of transportation. Time to boat in Dragon Quest VI is 8.5 hours, your first boat at least. In the dream world, instead of a boat, you sail a floating island. Yeah, it's got like a steering wheel and an inn and a few skeletons, and it's a floating drivable island. What do you want me to say? Finally free to explore anywhere you wanted, as long as you don't sail past this floodgate right here. Before you do that, we need to make sure you visit all of these places first so you can get your special story events. Then we're gonna have to ask you to make sure you do the same in the dream world. Now, you just need to sign these forms with your first initial last name, verifying that you've received your story in the correct order. Super. Please keep your hands, feet, and arms inside the vehicle at all times. Thank you for riding Dragon Quest's Anywhere You Want adventure. Exaggerating, clearly, but not that far off. This game split the open world into 2 halves, the inside and the outside, and it did this because they couldn't establish a narrative that made any sense without it. But here's the kicker, the story still doesn't make sense. Dragon Quest VI starts like most games in the series. Here's your villain. Oh no, he did a bad thing. Go get him. But then it swerves your expectations. Very early in the game, that big bad gets taken down and a prior revelation becomes the main plot of the game. It turns out that Murdaugh, the big bad you just beat, had split the heroes' bodies from their dream counterparts, making them incomplete. What you could consider the second act of Dragon Quest VI then becomes about finding your other half in order to complete yourself, a pretty obvious metaphor for the journey of self-discovery, and a joke the newer localization runs into the ground. Oh, you say you're looking for your other half. My, that's some pretty meaningful stuff. I hope you find the answers you're looking for. I lost where else in the footage this happens, but just imagine that with different sentence structure, but tens of times, and picture me being agitated. And hey, you know what? This twist to the plot was something you were totally down for. It was still easy to follow, it was different, and it still gave you a reason for a quest. That's like 3 out of 4 on the list of enjoyable plots. But the minute you had access to a boat, this narrative started to fall apart and actively get in the way of your gameplay. The last time a Dragon Quest game was this open-ended about where to go next was 3, and in that game, every location had a self-contained adventure. You would show up at a village and they'd be all like, "Ah, no, there's like a monster or something, help us." And then you'd go into a nearby dungeon, fight the monster, go back to the village without ever needing to go anywhere else first, get some special item you needed to get to the final boss, and then you'd sail around until you found a new place with its own problems. All the while, people would be talking about your father and how huge his penis was to remind you of why you were doing all of this stuff in the first place. You could do this in any order you wanted to, and the story would never be any more confusing. But in Dragon Quest VI, a lot of these little vignettes assume that you visited and completed other things in a particular order beforehand, despite that order never being enforced. As a result, the main plot loses itself among a billion questions you want to ask. Hurry, we must teach you this spell before the Archfiend strikes. I'm sorry, who? I'm just looking for a statue that looks like me. Hello? Man, GC, we better hurry and find these legendary relics. Wait, I thought we were searching for my other half. Hey, look, it's your other half. Why is he actually moving around when yours was just a statue? And why is it that people in the real world have dream counterparts that do whatever the hell they want, but we have to fuse with ours to be whole again? How come people that die can keep living in the dream world, even though people in the dream world are only there because someone else is sleeping? And how come the dream world is a real physical place if it's people's souls that inhabit it? Does that mean everyone but us has their soul physically manifested just a few miles above our heads? Are we soulless? Look, it's one of Mortimer's generals. Let's get him! Don't you fucking ignore my questions. And who the fuck is Mortimer? What's worse is how uncommitted they were of establishing villains for anything longer than a battle's time span. Every boss, and I do mean every boss except for the big bad at the beginning, is introduced right before your battle with them and dies right after. And it's only after beating the last of his generals that someone finally clues you in on the secret evil they've been talking about out of context this whole time. Mortimer, the Archfiend. Oh, well, now that you have a villain 26 hours into this 30-hour game, I suppose I should just start investing myself into the story. It sounds like I'm being unfair, but it's so exasperating to see such a simple formula that's worked so well in the past get blitzed on so many levels. And you know what? Had these scenarios been organized better so that they made a stronger, cohesive narrative, I'm sure I would have very much liked the story a lot more, because it's clear Mr. Hori's strengths in that regard haven't waned. The dialogue was great, and despite the rest of its failings, Dragon Quest VI managed to deliver some strong main characters. Maybe the strongest in the series so far. Dragon Quest VI's vignetting excelled when it was being used to flesh out the main characters. Well, most of the main characters. I really don't know why this person is here. I can't remember his name or what his deal is. He's got glasses and horns on his hat, so maybe he's some kind of nerdy BDSM stripper. Okay, so just the hero, Carver, Millie, and Terry. But these four get their time to shine and present who they are, and there's a lot to them. Carver is an impatient, impulsive workhorse that's focused on getting things done, which incidentally lends to his natural building skills. Millie is kind, gentle, very independent, and willing to hold her own to get what she wants. Terry is mysterious, the guilt of past actions influencing him down a path of darkness before the hero rescues him. And our player character is a courageous soul, willing to make the ultimate sacrifice for those he cares about. Hey, wait a second. I have a theory. A game! Stop it. Dragon Quest VI was delayed for a year during its development, and I think in no small part due to Chrono Trigger's huge success. Given the 9-month space between the two, it isn't too far-fetched to believe that the development team caught wind of Chrono Trigger and how successful it was probably going to be. Especially considering that Toriyama and Hori himself were working on both. Maybe Hori thought Dragon Quest VI was going to need a little more panache to stand tall next to Chrono Trigger. That constantly flip-flopping plotline is a strong indication of the team having one idea, but then scrapping parts of it to make space for something more similar to Chrono Trigger's time travel story. Hence the ambiguously defined dream world full of contradictions. This change to the plot was also an extension of game length itself, which would explain why the dungeons in this game aren't as well designed, and why there's a heavy dependence on a combat system that just can't hold the game up on its own. It makes sense. The only consistent part of this game is its combat, because it's the only thing that wouldn't be affected by a sudden expansion of the world. But I could just be fucking wrong. And I think we're done here. This is a game I'm going to use in the future as an example of a bad game with a lot of polish. It has all of these problems, right? But because all of those problems don't break the game per se, and aren't particularly offensive, plenty of people have probably played it just fine. Dragon Quest VI sold millions of copies when it released, but in no way does it match any of the games in the franchise in terms of quality and design, and though it deserves the credit for making a lot of big changes that have benefited the series, it screws so many things up, and it is a challenge to screw that many things up. But then again, it's not awful, and even though I wouldn't recommend it as your first Dragon Quest, it's something you could still check out if only to know what a bad Dragon Quest game looks like, which is still not garbage. God, but it's such a slog that's not worth the 30 hours either.
I'm terribly sorry for being away for so long, but you see, I've died and gone to heaven, playing Dragon Quest VII. Also, my cape's at the dry cleaners.
Originally developed for the Nintendo 64 disk drive? What? Seriously? Dragon Quest VII later released on the PS1 in late 2000, 4 months after the PS2 came out, and a whole year after that in North America. So it shouldn't be too surprising to hear that it didn't sell well in the States, despite it being the first Dragon Quest game released there in just about 9 years. The beginning of the game was about as quiet as its US sales numbers.
Dead quiet.
It was an opportunity for you to test out the controls after shifting to a different console, and to get acquainted with the, state-of-the-art user interface. It's just an overlay of white text. But hey, at least we've got new FMV technology. Jesus!
Whoa, put her back in. She's not done yet.
Jokes aside, even in this little pocket of the humongous adventure you were about to embark on, the new tech did prove its worth right away. This was the first time Dragon Quest ever had a 3D space, and it allowed for new ways of building environments. Those pots and barrels that were sitting next to buildings could now be hidden away behind the buildings, or tucked away in an alley that you'd only be able to see using your new rotating camera. You'd think this would have made exploring towns tedious, but it actually made it more engaging. Towns could be much bigger, architecture could be vastly different and better realized with 3D models, and the interior design of buildings was capable of being more complex. So many visually different locations made everything feel brand new, and that novelty was renewed with each town you came across. The 3D space gave dungeons way more room to play around with layouts and puzzle designs too. And speaking of dungeons,
Let's talk about Vindication. Can I get a chair? I need a chair for this bit. Can we get a chair here, please? I'm the only person in this room.
in the Dragon Quest VI episode, I gave Heartbeat a lot of flack over poor level design and encumbering reliance on combat and terrible forms of plot progression.
Good. This is good. Now please voice over GC. Continue.
All in all, it was a disappointing first impression that desperately needed correction, and there is no clearer recognition of the problems in Dragon Quest VI than the first dungeon of Dragon Quest VII.
No.
The first dungeon of this game wasn't a giant labyrinthian mess, there weren't any arbitrary buttons to push, no. The whole dungeon was a series of puzzles that were all steps to solving a bigger puzzle and could be completed in any order you chose. These puzzles were good, and naturally, they made the dungeon good. In fact, the dungeons in Dragon Quest VII are probably the best in the series. Period. They weren't just new versions of dungeons we'd seen before, though you did have those. Your movement-based puzzles, your trick rooms that needed to be exited in the right way, even your puzzle-less mazes. But they also added dungeons centered around solving word riddles, physics-based dungeons having to do with weight, and rooms that use two different mechanics in tandem to create a more complex problem to solve. This would have been enough to satisfy any fan of the series, but they pushed even further and took full advantage of the technology at their disposal. Dungeons like this gravity-bending insanity that required you to look at it literally from different angles, or any of the vision-obscuring dungeons that could only work with the new isometric camera perspective. And they didn't take all the extra space they now had to pad out the dungeons either. Dungeons in Dragon Quest VII were either kept small or packed with something interesting to do in every room, and in some of those rooms, no random battles. To further prove to you that Heartbeat was aware of the last game's issues, there was absolutely no combat in the entire first segment of the game. Not in the overworld or the dungeon, and not just there. A lot of puzzle rooms in the game were safe zones where you could focus completely on the puzzle you were solving and not worry about random encounters causing you to lose your train of thought. More than that actually, about a third of the game didn't involve combat at all. According to Mr. Hori, the focus during development was on puzzle solving instead of story, so it makes sense that Heartbeat would want to push that gameplay as much as possible. And that helps explain why Dragon Quest VII's narrative was more or less a redo of the last game's narrative. In Dragon Quest VI, we had the real world and the dream world, and it was very difficult to put together how one affected the other, even though they did. For Dragon Quest VII, Mr. Hori decided to throw subtlety out the window and wrote a story about time travel. Because pre-Chrono Trigger? Risky business, but post-Chrono Trigger, that shit was a hot commodity. So I got a game where you catch monkeys that got police sirens on their heads with a butterfly net. We aren't currently looking for any new IPs at this time. It's got time travel in it. So we had the past, a world infested with monsters and many lands being terrorized by them, and the present, a world with a single continent at the center of a vast ocean with no monsters at all. To visit the past, you had to find stone shards that you then fitted onto pedestals. Once you completed the picture on a pedestal, it would transport you to the land depicted on it. Dungeons, bosses, main storylines, it all took place in the isolated lands of the past, and each one had its own little problem to solve. You could call them quests. Ha! Bet you weren't expecting that one, were ya?
Once you'd completed the quest of that land, it would reappear in the present, free of monsters, mostly, and complete with a new set of items to pilfer from its houses and NPCs to fill you in on what's been going on in the hundreds of years you haven't been around. The return to the same place after technically just being there never felt like it was dragging on part of the game longer than it needed to be. The reason? Pacing. I was going to apologize about how long it's taken me to get this episode out, but...
Do you know how long this game is?
On average, Dragon Quest's main story takes about 100 hours to complete. To put that into perspective, that's longer than 2 weeks of a full-time 9-to-5 job. That's a fucking career, but it doesn't feel like one. Your quests in the past were isolated and therefore felt like episodes in a grander story being told. And the present served as an intermission between those episodes, but mechanically served as an ever-growing hub world. What was one tiny island slowly grew into many continents containing the staple side features of the series. The closest comparison we have to this is in Dragon Quest III, where completing a quest had the implication that you became a hero. In Dragon Quest VII, you had tangible evidence of that. Yeah, that's right, I earned this puff puff.
Ooh, baby.
That physical representation of progress kept you from feeling bogged down by the game's length. There was something about saving the day in the past, going to the present, and having a slew of new interactions and potential features to show for it. Interactions and features that you could only get to with our favorite way of getting places. Time to boat in Dragon Quest VII is 4 hours! You know what? The title screen for this game had a boat on it. I should have guessed boat was gonna be a
thing early on. It was mostly just to get around in the present though, and even then only the first time you visited places. Returning to areas in the present was a frequent occurrence either because of plot reasons or more often to change classes. Time to class in Dragon Quest VII was about 23 hours.
What? Time to vote was too short. I gotta get my fix somehow.
There were now 10 base classes instead of 9, and the abilities available to each class were reduced to just 1 per mastery level gained, if that. Instead of this limiting your options though, it gave every class a meaningful skill set that you could complement your character's existing abilities with. More importantly, your party could learn hybrid abilities by mastering one base class, then switching to another base class and raising their mastery in that to a certain point. But you also needed to master specific base classes to unlock intermediate classes. Hybrid abilities were powerful, but obtaining them meant prolonging access to intermediate classes, which gave significant stat boosts that you absolutely needed towards the end of the game. Because of this, players were challenged to juggle classes effectively, to plan ahead what each character in their party would learn, but make adjustments to that plan when it was in their better interest to do so. And because changing your class also altered your base stats for the duration you were in that class, the roles each of your party members served frequently changed. 1 minute your healer was now your highest damage dealer, and your highest damage dealer was now your support spellcaster. Dragon Quest VII was a rare occurrence in the series where players were practically demanded to change alongside the characters they were controlling, to adapt to new situations and learn how to deal with them, to grow and accept when times have changed, and to accept that the same answers won't work for every question presented to you, which is reflected in the game's coming-of-age story, about a boy that travels through time to many places and is exposed to many cultures at 2 distinct points in their history that all have different ways of solving familiar, and at the same time, unique problems. I know, right? I didn't think I was gonna wax poetic on this episode either, but I managed to sneak something in there. When you think about it, this is definitely the most experimental Dragon Quest game. Crazy dungeon designs, non-open world gameplay, a weird floating rock, guest appearance by Carrot Top.
When you play a game as long as this one is, in a series as rooted to its core as Dragon Quest, you have a rare opportunity to learn exactly what the people that made it were good at.
Heartbeat poured everything they had into this game, and I mean everything. After numerous delays, Dragon Quest VII finally came out, and Heartbeat went on a hiatus that they never came back from. This game is essentially a case study of the people that made it, and we've already learned that, given enough time, they were capable of exceptional level design and fulfilling combat mechanics. But there were some aspects of Dragon Quest that Heartbeat just couldn't wrap their heads around. Enemy placement, at least in my limited knowledge of what making an RPG is like, has to be one of the lower end parts of the process. I just feel as though there's a lot of common sense when it comes to that sort of thing, and Heartbeat didn't have any. Enemy designs are fine, though just like last time, there's some real stinkers in the bunch. An egg. That's the best you could do. What's next? You gonna take the scenery and give it
I'm afraid of saying anything else.
In a game that's 100 hours long, you shouldn't encounter the recolor of a monster in the area right after the one where you encountered the original version. You don't have to turn a regular enemy into a boss if you have over 300 monsters you haven't shown your players yet. And you don't put well monsters into the random battle pool. How does that make sense? How do they move the well? And that's just normal enemies. Don't even get me started on bosses. It's bad enough almost all of them summoned add-ons and had incredibly similar movesets. It's worse that a lot of the bosses could take multiple turns, but only if they felt like it, so it was impossible to strategize against it. It's the worst that they recycled the boss from the last game, name and all, and made 2 boss fights out of him. But this one in particular, this stupid piece of shit, could summon 4 minions, each of them able to cast sleep on your entire party, and took 2 turns to kill each if you didn't heal that turn and if no one was already asleep. That's busted as fuck. And I would be calling Dragon Quest VII out on this and saying it's unforgivable, but it's really not. Not in the grand scheme of things. It had an excuse. In a game that was over 100 hours, including side quests and post-game bonus dungeons, it was okay to have 1 or 2 outrageous boss designs. It was okay when not every dungeon was picture perfect. And it was even okay when some plot lines got dropped and went nowhere. Well, hero, it was glorious fighting alongside you. Now go home.
But aren't you supposed to be my dad or something?
I said go home! And hey, you still had those obtuse progression flags assigned to random NPCs, or to speaking to a specific NPC twice for no reason, but all of that were like sprinkles on top of a chocolate frosted donut. I don't know about you, but I don't like sprinkles. However, they've never stopped me before.
You know, I'm actually disappointed Heartbeat didn't get the chance to try a third time. They make good donuts.
All those man-hours put into making Dragon Quest VII would have surely transferred into substantial experience put towards a near-perfect, if shorter, Dragon Quest game. I feel bad about ranking on them so hard last time. As it turned out, they were capable.
Feeling fine, feeling great, because today it's all about Dragon Quest VIII. Hey, you like that? Took me 8 months to come up with it.
Oh my god, where to even begin? The year was probably 2002. Square Enix was looking for new talent to help make the next Dragon Quest game under the supervision of Yuji Horii. Mr. Horii was looking for a group capable of bringing Dragon Quest to a true 3D environment on the PlayStation 2. They needed credibility in that regard, but also experience with working on RPG games and creating RPG systems. Enter brand spanking new developer studio Level 5. They'd just finished releasing Dark Cloud 2, the sequel to their freshman title Dark Cloud. These two games were practically exploding with all of that, and so Level 5 became hand-picked to help create Dragon Quest VIII. Dragon Quest VIII Journey of the Cursed King held within it many firsts in the series. It was the first game in the franchise to be officially called Dragon Quest outside of Japan, and the first game in the series to have ever been released in Europe. Europe, I am so sorry, there's truly nothing I can say that will make up for the games you've missed, except for you got the best one first!
I'm so excited! Let's talk about visuals.
Dragon Quest VIII was the first game in the series to have full 3D environments and character models. Dragon Quest VII had 3D spaces, but because of its isometric camera, those spaces lacked scale. From a bird's eye view, only the most gargantuan objects gave off the impression of size, and everything else... If you brought that camera down to the character's height and put it much closer to the environments players would be walking around in, the variety in the size of buildings became much more obvious. That's not a bad thing though. With this new perspective, towns had greater freedom in design. Doors didn't all have to be facing a main street, and towns could have their own sets of alleys and more elaborate layouts that didn't need to worry about whether or not the player could see it from a top-down view. More vertical elements could be added, and the better tech at their disposal on the PS2 meant that multi-floored interiors could be fully explored without loading screens as well. Unless it was a really big interior like a castle, in which case we'll let it slide because it's advancing technology and not
Phenomenal cosmic powers!
Lighting and colors mattered now in order to make the player feel appropriate in the space they were in. The warm, cozy aesthetic of Irkutsk to represent the sheltering it provided from the harsh cold. The pale and ugly repurposed rooms at Pickham's prison-turned-hotel. The drab brown walls, black furniture, and stark lighting to reflect the boring, redundant internet show about video games.
Hey!
Because the camera was so much closer to the player and the environment, more detail went into decoration and NPCs. Sometimes it was completely unnecessary, but infinitely cool. If you were a keen observer, you could see the segmented pieces that made up furniture and how it was put together. You could see the amount of work put into the new character models if you used the first-person camera to examine the townspeople. Not only were the 2D sprites brought into the modern age as almost one-to-one recreations of their designs, but variants were made of each model wearing different colors that they alternated in order to make every NPC feel specific to the area you were in. And more supporting characters than ever before were given unique appearances to cement that authenticity. There was a whole kingdom in mourning where everyone had sad, depressing faces. It's the only time in the game you'd see these expressions on these models, and you wouldn't notice it unless you zoomed in on their faces out of curiosity because of how crappy the native resolution on the PS2 is. If only there was a way to play this game but up-resed so we could see everything in excruciating detail. Yeah, just like this. Wow, this looks awesome. You can see the cobblestones in people's faces and the curves of Yangus's titties. This is amazing. How'd you get it looking like that? I want to know. Let's keep this a secret between the two of us, Level 5 didn't abuse the added scale and detail to make every city a sprawling landscape just because they could. Most towns didn't take more than 10 minutes to explore. Instead, they focused on making them different to move around in. Irkutsk was a ring city existing totally indoors, and Pikam was this winding set of seedy slums and rooms suspiciously hidden away in corners and dead ends. It also had this underground sauna with big burly buff guys that just want you to sweat. I want you to sweat with them and just be incredibly moist in a room full of rippling muscle. They want you to take your clothes off because it's so hot and you're soaking wet. This went beyond solely being a visual improvement. It was done with motion in mind. In the case of Dragon Quest, moving in a 3D space feels different from moving in 2D. In 2D, it's as if your character's pulling the ground towards them. In 3D, your character feels more like a moving dot on a stationary map. As a result, it feels slower. The lack of a scrolling environment gives off the impression that you're moving at a slower pace, but if you were to, say, move around in a condensed area, like the towns or castles in-game, it'd feel like you were breezing through it. And since you could spot an important character out of a crowd, meant less time wandering around looking for them and greater odds of building momentum. Dragon Quest VIII is about building momentum.
It's relatively shorter than 7, but I think that's because they recognized how much of a slog 7 felt like. It might be more than 100 hours, but it felt like an eternity trapped at the bottom of a seeping abyss with only the faint echo of yesterday's happiness as another boss fight implanted its mental scar inside my mind. 8 was a complete opposite, especially when it came to its dungeons.
Like the way they handled towns, dungeons weren't sprawling labyrinths for the sake of showing off that they could be. They were modestly sized and made full use of the space, putting players at the entrance to a spacious area and having them spot the levers they'd have to pull ahead of time, making a hallway serve as the entrance to small rooms that housed treasure chests and books with history on the place. Notice that I didn't say anything about navigation or getting lost. For the first time in the series, a phrase that has become synonymous with this retrospective, I'm sure, dungeons now had maps. Typically the first thing you'd find in the dungeon, and a hell of a lot more meaningful than it may seem. For a series that not once bothered with giving players a dungeon map and even used that unknown as a quote-unquote gameplay mechanic, this was a fucking statement. We're done trying to confuse you with mazes. These games aren't about getting lost in dungeons anymore. We don't want players doing that. Unfortunately, there wasn't much else to do in Dragon Quest VIII's dungeons besides somehow getting lost. You had your light puzzle element here and there, but never anything serious or really qualifying as a brain teaser. What they lacked in challenge, they made up for in speed though. Dungeons were short, quick to finish, and had unlockable shortcuts. If you somehow didn't manage to get through the whole dungeon on the first go, leaving and coming back was not going to be a problem anymore. Once again, we see another form of building momentum here. Quick towns, quick dungeons. With how fast you could move through this game, the effectiveness of anything they wanted to get across with it was going to be fleeting at best. There needed to be some kind of focal point, something players could really sink their teeth into, something permanent and longer lasting than a tasteful vase or a pretty face.
If only there were some form of battling system in this Japanese role-playing game.
Oh man, are we not done talking about the 3D thing. This retrospective and being a broken record go hand in hand. Thankfully, it wasn't too important here. Nothing really monumental. It was the first time we got to see our party members in combat, and there was a dynamic camera that made battles look like, well, battles. It goes without saying that a ton of work went into creating animations for monster attacks and special abilities. When you think about it from the perspective of a Dragon Quest fan, being able to see a slime as an articulating 3D model would have been enough. Oh my god, look, it's all wiggly! This game's the best! But Level 5 wanted to go beyond that minimum and create enemies specific to 3D space that affected gameplay in some way. They did this by creating enemy designs with multiple phases built into the model. Like these frog enemies that turn around when you hit them to reveal a much stronger opponent, or this group of monsters that combine into a stronger mini-boss monster if you allow them to. Phases, faces, both these examples are about never mind. It was a way to mix up the battles against the same enemies players were inevitably going to run into. This idea was what gave birth to one of the best mechanics to have ever existed in Dragon Quest.
There are two reasons why I think Dragon Quest VIII's combat is perfect. The first is the enemy design, and the second is the psych up system.
Your character could spend a turn building tension and keep spending turns building it up to exponentially increase the power of their next attack. Psyching up removed one of your party members from the action, and if they died or needed a heal to avoid a game over, that used up the tension they'd been building. Enemies had ways of rendering those turns spent psyching up pointless with status ailments, and a lot of bosses had an attack that removed all status effects on the party. But that's why it worked so well as a mechanic. You were always taking a risk by using it, but getting off that built-up attack was always worth it no matter how many turns you spent building it. Enemies could do it too, and it forced you to weigh every turn differently. Fighting with one staple strategy was the worst way to play Dragon Quest VIII because it would ignore a potentially devastating enemy who'd been building tension in the wings. If we throw in those multiple phased enemies alongside the ones building tension, we notice that the same battle against the same group of enemies had no guarantee to play out the same way twice. And this was huge. Okay, this was a lot harder to pull off back in the day. In fact, JRPGs at the time went in the complete opposite direction and made combat systems that rewarded players for repetition and knowing exactly how to deal with every encounter. This turn-to-turn gameplay in a JRPG where the enemy you're trying to kill and the abilities you're using to do it can change at any moment, that wasn't normal, that wasn't expected, that was not what people thought JRPGs were. This still isn't what people think JRPGs are. Everyone always tells me, man, turn-based RPGs suck, they're so boring, and I just want to...
I realize now that this game may be harboring some repressed feelings I have.
But Level 5 insisted on this, going so far as to remove the job system that had defined Dragon Quest combat for years. It wouldn't have worked with the speed Dragon Quest VIII was trying to build or fit in with the adaptive combat players would be exposed to, and I didn't want to play with it anymore, so they had to change it.
I get what I want.
What it needed was a version of the job system that allowed players to be as adaptable as their enemies were, but still create the sense of momentum that every other part of the game was building towards. I call it the skill point system. The skill point system brought order to chaos. On Level Up, every character got a number of skill points to put into any of 5 skill trees. These skill trees represented the weapons that each of them could equip, and a unique talent each of them possessed. After putting enough points into a skill tree, they gained an ability associated with the weapon the tree was based off of. While the job system was an anything goes hot mess, the skill point system provided the one thing it lacked. Quality.
I'm kidding. Direction. Plenty of freedom to create different kinds of parties, but limited just enough so that some semblance of balance could be achieved.
By putting points into certain weapon paths, the player would commit to using those weapons on their characters, and could even do so for multiple weapons on one character if they wanted to. This added to the adaptive nature of battles Level 5 was going for. Players could equip a staff onto Jessica for extra magic points, and then switch to a whip to cut back on spell use after that MP bonus had been exhausted. The hero could cycle between his primary weapon and his boomerang whenever the situation called for hitting multiple enemies or focusing on one target. The skill point system gave new importance to what weapons players equipped to their characters, and because it no longer dictated stats, never got in the way of progress. There was no setback to putting points into something else or changing what you wanted one of your characters to do. At worst, you were neutral. Yet, because you were leveling up and increasing stats, you were always improving. And since all you needed to do to make use of those older abilities was equip the weapon they were assigned to, a free action in combat that didn't take up a turn, you never lost access to those abilities. Item management in general played a huge role in Dragon Quest VIII and was way different to how it worked in previous games. It wasn't about buying and using the best equipment you could find anymore, since you were going to be focusing on specific weapons for each character. Level 5 still needed to cater to all the possible weapon choices though, so a lot of what shops sold would go unpurchased. This is why most of the items in Dragon Quest VIII had special abilities you could use without equipping them. There needed to be a reason for players to spend their gold outside of the very specific selection they wanted. If that reason didn't exist, there'd be little reason for shops to exist, and if shops didn't exist, I wouldn't have a way to vent my impulsive consumer tendencies.
So I think I lost it, but I bought this flask that had the Dark Souls Estus flask on it because I thought it was clever. I don't drink often enough to need a flask or anything. I just thought, I mean, it looked cool, but I don't really have a space for it or anything because I have this giant one that I also bought for no reason.
The skill point system was a much needed improvement, but where it solved one problem, it created another. Such is the struggle of the game designer. Level 5's challenge was to give relevance to unwanted items and make them useful to a player that was never going to use them otherwise.
Their solution was a little thing called alchemy.
In Dragon Quest VIII, you had access to an alchemy pot. It let you combine items and equipment together to make better ones, and provided another reason for players to fully explore towns and engage with NPCs. You couldn't just throw whatever you wanted in there and expect a result, you see. You had to experiment with different combinations of items to see what worked, or find recipes by reading books or talking to the townspeople. Once you had something cooking, you had to wait a while before you could see what you had created. Time you could spend completing a dungeon or finding more recipes in town. The recipes weren't as straightforward as you might think. Sometimes 2 scythes made an axe. Sometimes pouring milk and cow shit inside a helmet made a better helmet with horns. The science behind it is complicated. But alchemy meant that all those items you never paid attention to, even the inferior equipment you'd find in shops or had stored away in your inventory, were important again. Nobody would dare sell anything under the possibility that the piece of junk they were getting rid of was an ingredient for a powerful alchemy item. Players weren't going to hastily buy a new sword or bow if they could just make one that was better, but neither were they going to ignore the chance that something in those shops was going to be a key factor to getting the best equipment for their party. They had to weigh their options, decide whether to buy something that could potentially be quickly replaced by alchemy, sell a would-be alchemy ingredient for enough gold to buy something that would last them a while, or straight up buy ingredients and take weaker equipment into battle until they had finished making everything they wanted. This was the genius of this mechanic. While the skill point system reduced the amount of times you'd be spending gold, alchemy increased that gold's value, making it less profitable to sell your items and making everything a shop was selling valuable to the player.
The game was aggressive with ensuring you knew the ins and outs of alchemy, the skill point system, and everything else we've talked about. Before it could throw you to the wolves and give you its version of the Dragon Quest experience, it needed you to be ready for it. And it attempted to do that with a time-honored tradition that I think we've all enjoyed being a part of.
Time to boat in Dragon Quest VIII was 6.5 hours. Okay, this wasn't really our time to boat moment, but it was as important. Enemies hit harder, your new party member had new spells and was much more frail in battle compared to the first two, and it was the first time you could use the alchemy pot. Your actual time spent on that boat was short-lived, but the game was presenting you with an objective. Learn these mechanics because they're about to become a lot more important. And from this time to boat to the next one, you'd be getting yet another party member, an upgrade to the alchemy pot, and a lot of character building. The game wasn't opening up completely, but it was starting to let the waters in, if you'll excuse the pun. The areas you were exploring were getting bigger, and the roads didn't always show the way anymore. Around the time you had to start looking past what was originally the straight path, the long-running side quests of Dragon Quest VIII began to make themselves known. Mini-medals were everywhere now, but not too different from how we remembered them. Though, to be fair, there's not much you can do to make a basic collectible fresh and exciting. But if you're listening, Mr. Hori, hear me out. Mini metal mimics.
Huh?
Level 5 decided to downsize casinos in Dragon Quest VIII. All those exciting games were stripped down to just slots, bingo, and roulette. There is no Baccarat in Baccarat Casino. That's the name of a town in the game with a casino. I haven't done a good job setting these jokes up. Compared to 7, where there was some level of thought to pushing the odds in your favor, 8's casinos are totally chance-based. You couldn't rely on casino prizes to bolster your equipment because of how unlikely you'd... Oh. Pay no attention to the following video footage. The Monster Arena was back with a familiar appearance. Like the Slime Arena from 6, you could enter into various ranks to win prizes, but couldn't directly control the monsters in battle. The Monster Arena was pivotal to Dragon Quest VIII. First of all, this guy.
Prepare to be dazzled.
This is Mori. His scarves blow in the wind, even indoors.
Can you feel it? The sights, the sounds, the smells! Over the Monster Arena!
Everything out of Mori's mouth is a sexual innuendo.
But you know what they say. You never know the depths of your own passion until you play with yourself, eh?
He's the best character to have ever existed in Dragon Quest. But even he's not as important as Torneko motherfucking Taloon! No, actually, the return of the Monster Arena came with changes that elevated it beyond being a simple distraction. It was now a full-fledged feature. There were monsters you could find roaming the overworld, and defeating them after meeting Mori allowed you to add them to your team. Monsters in your roster were stronger the higher your level was, and eventually you could call your team into regular battles. There was synergy to the monsters you put into your team. The right combination could unlock additional bonuses or secret moves, like these 3 golems that transformed into a super boss monster. Again, another way to deal with an ever-changing enemy and ever-changing situations. Even if you didn't want to add them to your team, even if you were crazy or stupid enough not to want a team of monsters, why would you not want a team of... I digress. The overworld monsters dropped coins that you could sell for gold once you defeated them, regardless of whether or not you added them to your team. You know what that gold and those prizes would have been useful for? Alchemy. Are ya starting to get the picture here? The Monster Arena still added something to the game, even if you didn't do it. This was true for the other features. Even if you didn't care for alchemy or the new combat mechanics, they still affected each other. The only way not to be exposed to their influence was to not play the game. But the combat, the monsters, alchemy, they all shared one thing in common. Something Dragon Quest VIII possessed that was genuinely different to any previous Dragon Quest.
And yeah, it's related to the 3D thing. The overworld.
Hills, cliffsides, and rock formations that changed what used to be a flat, traversable surface into a landscape with nooks and crannies. An overworld that was able to have landmarks far into the distance, and areas independent of towns or dungeons that worked as checkpoints to save and rest. Between finding treasure chests, scouting for monsters, finding new areas, and completing alchemy while doing so, the overworld was the center stage for every feature. Dragon Quest VIII was an RPG that focused on its combat, and it revolved every new mechanic it introduced around it, but the world was the vessel that tied everything together. No other overworld in any other Dragon Quest game up to this point had succeeded in doing that. There was nothing to those big open spaces besides separating one town from another, but here it was alive, with waterfalls and animal graveyards and rivers, with strong monsters guarding treasure chests and hidden paths to be stumbled upon. It was maybe a little too big for its own good. Sure, it helped build momentum everywhere else, but these long stretches of nothing soured the near-perfect equation level 5 had been building. Certainly not bad for a first attempt during the age where everyone was still figuring out how to do this properly, or even compared to the gargantuan open-world games of today. By the time you acquired faster transportation, though, your wonderment at these articulate lands was replaced by haggardness and impatience. Your real time to boat in Dragon Quest VIII was 26 hours. At this point, you had the whole party assembled. You'd proven your understanding of how they operated in combat, and you'd no doubt settled on how you wanted to build each character. You had gained a level of competency using alchemy. You had spent enough time with the characters in your entourage to understand motives and backgrounds. You became comfortable controlling this group in gameplay as the hero character had grown closer to and comfortable with the new friends he had made on his journey. A parallel between you and who you were playing as had been formed.
Wow, it's almost like video games can be a vessel for interactive storytelling or something.
Do you see?
The floodgates had opened and the waters were finally rushing in to meet you, and you were ready. This was represented in Dragon Quest VIII's actual narrative, when in order to get your boat to sea, the water literally rushes in to create the path.
Do you see?
And then you got on your boat and you took a look at your map, right? You knew you had to get to the western continent, but there was quite a few routes to do that. There's a point to this, just let me get there. Up until now, the game had been teasing you with areas you couldn't access by walking to them. And your boat's starting position directly faced this tiny island you saw earlier off the coast of the port from the first boat ride. That's the mini metal island, and you went and you turned in your mini metals and got your bonus items. But from there, you could see a new, bigger island you hadn't seen before. You know, maybe the western continent can wait. On any path to the western continent, the islands on the way pulled your attention from where you had to go. The game was going to be a bit more open-ended from now on, but would still eventually funnel you to forward progression. Again, a form of building and maintaining momentum, and we've talked about how many parts of Dragon Quest VIII do that. But how? What is the one thing that all these pieces of Dragon Quest VIII possess?
Do you see?
If there is a word to describe the Dragon Quest series, it would be dynamic. With each new title came a new idea or change in some way, shape, or form. Now, the games on their own, not so much. Within their own realm, they never broke out of the simple, straightforward gameplay that defined the series from day one. They just found different ways to do it. So when I say Dragon Quest VIII was a love letter to the Dragon Quest series, as well as the quintessential Dragon Quest, even though it's very different from the other games, I want you to understand where I'm coming from. It pays homage to the entire franchise and follows suit by throwing in some of its own concepts, but it redefines staple elements. It is a new foundation for future Dragon Quests and a history book for what previous Dragon Quests looked like. From now on, this is Dragon Quest. This is the new traditional RPG. This is the standard. Playing 1 through 7 feels like this evolving process, but 8 feels like a passing of the torch. It's too different to be another step in the series, but is still very much a part of the family. GC Positive, you've just said today's keyword.
Yes! Do I win anything?
No!
Oh. Well, anyway.
Dragon Quest has always been about family. That didn't change for Dragon Quest VIII, but the amount of storytelling and the method used did. The humor of the Dragon Quest series was finally able to bloom. Dragon Quest eventually grew into a comedy over time. Sure, it could get dark or serious when it needed to be, but those somber moments were broken up by bits of humor and comedic relief. The jokes always felt out of place, and the lack of a visual element caused most of them to fall flat, however. Yeah, that's kinda like one of my videos. But because of the new wild expressions, and at least in the West, the voice acting, Dragon Quest VIII's comedy added to the narrative instead of distracting from it. Those lighter moments were used as character development or plot progression. King Trode's soft spot for people that remind him of his daughter, and then him ordering you to go off and help them. Yangus and Jessica starting a bar fight when you meet Angelo.
What's with you two, eh? Two blokes ganging up on one bird? Behave.
Yangus's unfaltering devotion to you.
I should have known a bird wouldn't get a story like ours, Gov.
Guy love, that's all it is. Guy love, he's my
mine, I'm his.
Really anything related to Yangus.
God blimey!
But the storytelling could also be subtle, leaving small hints in the surprised face of a king you've never met, or your hero being immune to curses. A character's backstory being disguised as a questionnaire you needed to pass in order to meet him. That's it, that's all you need, that's perfect. Things like that were scattered all over the game and always told a story about family. Because Dragon Quest VIII was not as segmented as Dragon Quest VII was, family as a concept was explored in spades. The loss of a loved one, growing up with neglect, disagreeing with your parents, and more seriously, having a falling out with family over the death of a loved one. This was not a Dragon Quest that was fixated on the destination. It was not about killing the bad guy, at least not really. The focus was turned to the people you met, your own party members, and the relationships formed along your travels. It was about the journey.
Subtle little details.
Very little time was given to our villains, if at all, but even they possessed some kind of family. What made them villains, however, was when they broke a family apart or hurt them, in some cases even their own. It is the destruction or damaging of family, either literally or metaphorically, that labeled these characters as villains and genuinely made you dislike them. It was a classy way of saying anyone who seeks to hurt you or the ones you love, even if that person is considered family, is no good. Even though Dragon Quest VIII worshipped its sanctity, it was very grounded in acknowledging that family can become our worst enemies. This is why it upheld that family is not always derived from blood and could be found in those you trust. The people who will be there to make you happy, to worry about you in times of crisis, or to lend an ear to you when you need someone to listen. For most people, it can and will be your mother, your father, your brothers and sisters, but it isn't limited to that. It made the effort to show that family is not unchanging. It's built, it's adjusted, sometimes it gets damaged, and the challenges it brings rarely ever remain the same. In short, family is dynamic.
Do you see?
Dragon Quest VIII isn't just my favorite Dragon Quest game, it's one of my favorite games of all time, if not the favorite. But it's not perfect, it's got some real problems. Mori isn't a playable character. It runs terribly on the PS2 and there's noticeable hanging when it loads in the animation for special attacks. There's visual tearing and a couple of split-second texture glitches now and then, and the game has massive slowdown issues with big fights or high-up areas. This menu is pretty, but is functionally worse than the basic menus in the previous games. Mori isn't a playable character. Alchemy is great, but tedious if you're trying to complete all your recipes before an upcoming boss fight. This gets worse late in the game when higher leveled alchemy recipes take longer to complete. Mori isn't a playable character, and you're never given a chart for the skill trees, so you never know exactly how many points you need to reach a new skill level. You're playing it by ear most of the time. Full disclosure, just look up the table and plan ahead.
Or like I've always suggested in this series, play the 3DS remake.
I was concerned about the visual quality of the 3DS version and the lack of the pretty menu. It didn't take long to win me over though. Every problem I've listed is fixed in the remake. Alchemy is instantaneous, the game runs better, you can see what skills you're going to get at what number of points, you can save skill points for later if you want to, and right in line with how Dragon Quest VIII was originally designed, the remake goes beyond what it needs to be. There's a fast mode for battles, dungeons were given more mechanics, more content was added to the game, new voiceover work was done, and yes, Mori is a playable Why are you even here? Go buy the remake. Mori is a playable character.
How many times can these headlines rhyme like fine wine, sending goosebumps down thine spine? Resign, mine Valentine, no need to whine, for design is divine in Dragon Quest IX. I used to be a slam poet.
When we started a new game in Dragon Quest IX, we opened to these words. Hello? Is there anybody there? If you're there, say something. Show yourself. Thus do the voices of the mortals plead, ever hopeful of proof of our existence. For how long have we watched over their realm? For how long have we Celestrians existed? The word usage is a bit condescending, isn't it? The mortals plead and we watch over, la-dee-da. Well, that was you. You were a Celestrian, a guardian angel for the mortal creatures on the planet below the observatory, your home. Along with their upturned noses at mortals, Celestrians were bound by a strict hierarchy that prevented them from opposing their superiors. They protected their puny mortal charges in order to gain benevolence, an item they gave to the world tree Yggdrasil so that it would one day bear golden figs. And soon after you completed your apprenticeship under your master Aquila, it did, marking the end of the Celestrians' watch over the mortal realm. Until of course Calamity struck by forces unknown, shaking the earth and throwing you off the observatory to the world below. Right off the bat, we were told exactly what this game was going to be about god complexes, about authority, and about what that means for either side of that dynamic. The Celestrians were set up to be these literal holier-than-thou types, so wrapped up in pecking order that it physically prevented them from going against it. Your descent to the land of the mortals in the fashion it happens is the stripping of that Celestrian superiority. You lost your wings, your halo, and because of the timing, the same people that were grateful to your invisible work as a guardian considered you a terrible omen that showed up with the earthquake. With the town suspicious of you, no status, and powerless to get back to the observatory, you experienced a total role reversal. You were the one in need of support, and from the same humans you looked down on as too weak to do anything themselves. That's right, you needed friends. Last time we talked about Dragon Quest VIII and how it was objectively the best game of all time. Do not write into the comments wherever they are at the current date you're watching this to debate me on it. I will not listen to you and may also possibly be dead. It was a commendable achievement for everyone involved, reasserting the series as a flagship title for powerful home consoles. It pushed the boundaries of what Dragon Quest was capable of, expanding on mechanics, dropping obsolete practices, and creating a quintessential single-player experience. And that's why Yuji Horii called upon the services of Akihiro Hino and his team at Level 5 once again to make the next Dragon Quest game a handheld title designed around multiplayer. I don't know why. Really? Why would you? What? I've become somewhat of a Dragon Quest Sherlock Holmes since starting this series, and that's a convenient way of saying I can be wrong about this, so don't take my word as gospel. Allow me to deduce why this happened. Dragon Quest has never done exceptionally well in the West, at least relatively compared to its Japanese audience. Do you see where I'm going with this? It may come as a shock to you if you're a big fan of Dragon Quest, but sales for any individual Dragon Quest game in the West had never exceeded roughly 650,000 copies compared to the overshadowing 4 million copies of Dragon Quest VII sold in Japan alone. With the exception of Dragon Quest VIII and the first Dragon Quest on the NES, none of the other games had surpassed 250,000 copies sold. After fans missing out on 2 entries in the franchise, a console shift, and a rough localization, Dragon Quest VIII came in and broke the first Dragon Warrior sales record in the States by almost triple the amount. That's huge. That's an opportunity to grow a global audience. To Square Enix, that meant appealing to a Western audience, and handhelds were growing ever more popular around this time back home anyway. So they took what is now the second best-selling console of all time, milked its multiplayer functionality, and you know what? It worked. Dragon Quest IX is the best-selling Dragon Quest game of all time, and the second best-selling Dragon Quest in every region outside of Japan, and it's intended to be a multiplayer experience. Dragon Quest IX had a ton of multiplayer features, including local co-op that let you and 3 other friends play the entire game from top to bottom together. And it was the good kind of co-op. You retained full control of your character and were able to travel to different areas than the host, even fight separate battles at the same time. With drop in drop out co-op, players were bound to be at different points in their own games. Level 5 needed to add features that would incentivize players to play earlier parts of the game with other people. They added respawning blue chests to dungeons and towns that guest players could open in the host's world. Be careful though, each of the blue chests have a chance to spawn a The overworld had alchemy materials to find in various regions that made splitting up a good idea. Playing with your friends was a fun way to discover items you might have missed in your own game, especially when they were wearing them. The multiplayer functionality inspired a character creator and bumped the visual aspect of characters' weapons and shields being rendered on their model in 8 to their entire set of equipment in 9. Pretty impressive stuff when you consider that each piece had 2 versions, one for each player character's model, the increased amount of equipment slots, and that the DS's native resolution was half of the PS2's. A smaller screen and softer hardware meant a need to pull the perspective back out to a top-down view, but not without acknowledging its faults. The rotation of the camera was now limited to about 180 degrees instead of the full 360. Doesn't sound like a big deal until you realize that the change forced every level to be designed around that limitation. Every door needed to face the camera, pots and barrels couldn't be hidden behind walls or pushed into the corner of an alley. There were secret areas and hidden doors the player would have to discover by paying attention to the environments they were exploring. The camera rotation reinforced Dragon Quest IX's intentionally smaller scale and reduced the headaches and nausea suffered from using Dragon Quest VII's camera. No matter where you were or what it looked like, you knew that everything existed inside the limited scope available to you. Dragon Quest IX wanted to get that across vehemently. This was a pocket-sized Dragon Quest for your pocket-sized console. It was about the same length as most other Dragon Quests, but 9 segments were broken up into easily digestible, bite-sized pieces. Towns were smaller and faster to excavate. Dungeons were compact and short, perfect for clearing a scenario after school with your classmates or during your lunch break with coworkers. It was almost a callback to Dragon Quest IV's town and dungeon design. No mechanics, and that kinda sucks, but paced extremely well and filled with treasure to find. Dragon Quest IX has a lot of parallels with Tokiden 2, a game I covered about the mutual benefits of helping one another. You learn an important addendum in Dragon Quest IX while playing with your friends though. Receiving help doesn't mean you aren't pulling your own weight. Getting back to the observatory was only the first act. You spoke to Apis Major, basically the Chief Celestrian. The Hold on, I can make it happen. Chiefestrian. Nailed it. You learned you were the first of those who fell off the observatory to come back. Aquila was still missing, and the golden figs had been scattered across the mortal realm. With every other Celestrian working to repair the observatory, Apis Major declared it your duty to recover the figs, citing your lack of Celestrian features as a sign of prophecy. Wow. Racist. Dragon Quest IX, Act 2, saw you recovering the 7 sacred figs from the mortals who consumed and became corrupted by them. The subtext wasn't subtle. The golden figs represented apples of Eden, the forbidden fruit that corrupted humanity from the Adam and Eve story in the Bible. 7 figs for 7 sins, 7 situations to see solved in succession, and 7 stories to learn from. 7 mortals all in a place of power, and 7 sets of people they affect. A fishing town succumbed to sloth after the head fisherman became a leviathan to provide his daughter with enough fish that she'd never go hungry again. The haunting of an academy by the wrathful spirit of its previous headmaster, kidnapping students and forcing lessons down their throats. There was a recurring relationship much like the one you had during the opening sequence of the game, of master and apprentice, of the Almighty and the Celestrians, of the Celestrians and each other, and lastly, of the Celestrians and the mortals. Remember that at this point in the series, the children who played the original Dragon Quest on the Famicom were now parents. Remember that as a series, Dragon Quest told a very long lesson about the principles of family. Religious context aside, that was the core message. It began by asking a question. How does parenting work? A god to its people, a parent to their child, a player to their peers. What is the role of those with authority? How does one support the people under their care, and how much is too much or too little? The second act used the 7 deadly sins as catalysts for behavior gone too far, and reflected each sin in the townspeople you spoke to. Envious servants of the queen and greedy residents of a small village overlooked by a generous duchess. But you were also affected. With this kind of multiplayer, sometimes you were the authority. The player farthest into the story, now a guest player in someone else's world with knowledge of what comes next. Did you lead your friends by the hand instead of allowing them to discover on their own? Maybe you were the host player with the unique power to summon your friends to your side whenever you wanted. Did you pull them away from their own curiosity without asking, or were you totally negligent to their errands? How'd your friends react? How did you when you were on the other end of it? Dragon Quest IX wanted you to feel like the people you were meeting. It wanted to show you what that looked like and also have a way for you to experience your own version of it. And it made sure you would, even if you were playing by yourself. Dragon Quest IX was almost an entry made in a parallel universe where 8 didn't happen. It took the same elements in the series that 8 did and went in an opposite direction with it for a different purpose, and that's why it brought back vocations. It wouldn't have been all that interesting if you and your friends were all the same exact character, would it? Vocations returned with a few important differences. You could change classes whenever you wished, like always, but unlike Dragon Quest VII, you couldn't keep the spells you learned. This was great for having classes to play as with friends who were at different levels or playing the same class you were. Because you couldn't keep spells from one class to the other, everyone was still required to fill certain roles. You needed a healer or a sturdy warrior that could soak damage for multiple turns. It kept things balanced by encouraging people to level up different classes on their characters when they were playing with someone else. But that didn't mesh with the concept of showing off the equipment you worked hard to get. You'd switch to a class that couldn't equip half the stuff you alchemized or bought. There needed to be a detail to vocations that encouraged class switching in the same way. So, level 5 took the skill point system and made a separate set of skills for each class. Combined with vocations, this is the best iteration of both these mechanics. I call it the vocation skill system. I am original and smart. Unlike spells, the abilities and passive bonuses earned with skill points carried over into any class. And while you still needed the right weapon for some of those abilities, different classes shared different sets of weapons and the skill tree related to them. The skill points a mage had spent into wands carried over into the armamentalist, allowing them to continue reaping the fruits of their labor while still having a fresh start with a new class. This gently suggested players swap to a class that had a weapon they were already skilled in. It created a path they could follow without forcing any hard prerequisites like being a certain level first or needing skill points in a specific tree. In multiplayer, the vocation skill system helped everyone bring something necessary to the table while allowing them to personalize their character mechanically. In single player, it personalized the party members players would create. Building your own party was back in Dragon Quest IX, and you could customize them as much as your main character. You can make your friends and eventually go crazy and talk to them as if they were real people. All right, Mike, it's up to you. You just gotta kill the metal slime this turn. Everything is dependent on you. Come on, you can do it. God damn it, Mike. You'll notice this is the first time I mentioned single player in this entire video. Like I said before, Dragon Quest IX was a multiplayer experience. Every new feature was meant to be played with friends or extend playtime well past the main plot of the story. You would eventually come across treasure maps while playing. They didn't lead to chests, though. Treasure maps hinted at different locations across the overworld that housed grottos, randomized dungeons of varying difficulty. They were a perpetual motion. You were always given a new treasure map for beating any grotto the first time, and there were thousands of treasure maps to have. The higher level the grotto, the more floors, the better the loot, and the more blue chests to open with your friends. And the harder the bosses. What a cool horsey! Oh. They weren't easy. You could access your first grotto about halfway into the second act, but the bosses were pretty damn demanding, even when you came back during the endgame. I've returned, horsey, and I've gotten stronger than the— I still can't fucking beat him. Are you serious? Grottos were for groups of players who either finished the main story or didn't want to advance it past a certain point while playing together. More importantly though, they're the reason your 3DS has a Street Pass function. Dragon Quest IX had a special feature. It was called Tag Mode. In Tag Mode, your Nintendo DS would go into a sleep state and use its wireless capabilities to interact with other DSs nearby. When the device is connected, character data and items were given to each player. This included a copy of a treasure map from each of their own collection. With 8 million possible grotto combinations, tag mode became insanely popular and lucrative to players looking for the combination that provided the best treasure, experience, you name it. It became so popular in Japan, in fact, that they had to ban people from playing Dragon Quest inside department stores since people figured that's where they'd get the most hits. They had to cordon off entire spaces in front of the stores for players to interact and share maps without disrupting foot traffic. They even opened a real-life version of the inn you accessed tag mode from. And in case you doubted me, most of the people showing up every day? Adults, many with children who were also playing Dragon Quest. The tag mode feature was so successful at achieving its purpose that Hideki Konno, producer of the 3DS's hardware, said it was what inspired him to include the Street Pass function on the 3DS. So all of those Street Pass features you love on your favorite 3DS games, yeah, Dragon Quest. You're welcome. Now here's the problem. All of this was really popular in Japan. The multiplayer functions were commonly used and people were always playing and trading maps together in Japan. You would always get tagged by hundreds of people on any given day in Japan. Japan has a huge population density that lends itself really well to the multiplayer features of Dragon Quest IX. But this multiplayer Dragon Quest game for a global audience forgot that outside of Japan, finding someone who also played Dragon Quest IX in a 25-mile radius consistently was rare, and Dragon Quest IX couldn't do multiplayer over Wi-Fi. As a multiplayer game, Dragon Quest IX is great, but without the consistent source of people to play it with, those design choices intended for co-op become annoying nuances and missing features. All the fun digressions from entries past were gone. No monster arena, no Mori, no monster taming, no Mori, no town building, no casinos, no Pachisi, and no Mori. With friends, moving around the overworld was nigh problematic, but on your own, things got a little less than ideal. The great additions to the overworld from 8 were missing here. No notorious monsters to fight, no treasure chests sprinkled about this world that was ripe for them. Material locations you found weren't marked on the map. Backtracking to pick them up was a nightmare. You didn't bother getting familiar with the world itself. Time to boat was 19.5 hours, but you wouldn't be sailing for long. You were landlocked for most of the game, and none of the islands to visit were natural detours on the main path. Ugh, it's fine, it's just Dragon Quest VIII would have put a chest there. Dragon Quest VIII would have had good overworld elements. It's like a child talking to a divorced father. Dragon Quest VIII would have bought me ice cream. You didn't have much reason to change your character's class without the multiplayer party to worry about fitting into. The minstrel was a great support that was thematically appropriate, and the party members you had total control over could be molded however you wanted. But that didn't stop Dragon Quest IX from scaling down gained experience for lower leveled characters. It was balancing meant for multiplayer, but in single player, it facilitated grinding and slowed players down whenever they changed classes. Alchemy was instantaneous now, but you couldn't alchemize anywhere you wanted to anymore. Since you had to access multiplayer from Patty's Pub, it made sense to put it there. You'd return from someone else's world and head straight to the pot to make things with what you came back with. But if you weren't doing that, having to go back and forth became a chore. Alchemy now required way more than just 2 or 3 ingredients. Fine if you were doing lots of multiplayer sessions, a mission to farm enough materials to make what you wanted to on your own. And like a lot of randomized dungeons, grottos by yourself were fun up to the point you fought all of the 12 possible bosses you could find in them. After that, it was rinse and repeat to farm for rare items and grind levels. Of course, there was tons of additional content you could access through the online service. An item shop with rotating offers, legacy grotto maps that took you through major boss fights from previous games, and VIP guests you might have recognized. But even so, it was easy to see why Level 5 made those things when you consider how playing with friends could go. They were thinking about balance and convenience for roaming players. But there's one feature that didn't fit in as either a multiplayer or single player feature: side quests. We've talked about the many ways Dragon Quest has offered additional content beyond the linear path, but there were never officially side quests. There was no list, no specific objective to do. You could just do things if you wanted to. You were like a kid with the amusement park all to yourself. What we called side quests in Dragon Quest IX were nothing like what you'd expect from the series. They're fetch quests. Boring MMO-styled fetch quests. MMO quests for non-MMO mechanics.
do you see the complication that it's okay if you don't, I'm gonna explain it, but do you see that you can't just.
So in addition to the normal NPCs in town, you could find NPCs with blue speech markers instead of white. These were NPCs with side quests you could accept and eventually complete for a reward. Most of them wanted you to bring back a specific alchemy material or monster drop.
Okay. I know some of you have been playing through this series since I started making these. Think about how often enemies drop items in Dragon Quest. Yeah, not often. Yeah.
Trying to complete these side quests amounted to grinding monsters or running around the overworld to pick up alchemy ingredients. The rewards were always either a different ingredient you could have gotten yourself or a nothing sum of gold that you could have easily obtained with 2 or 3 battles if you really needed to. Some were totally esoteric and kept you in the dark on how to complete them, offering no hints or direction. On top of 5, 6, 7 side quests popping up in every town you completed the story segment in, you were never given any notice when new side quests had appeared in locations you previously visited. If you did want to do these, you would blow right past them. Not that you'd be able to do all of them, since you could only accept 10 side quests at a time, and most were incompletable until much later than when they became available. But the worst part is that some of these side quests were related to unlocking new vocations. The requirements were so oddly specific that doing them in any reasonable fashion took a lot of work and sometimes plain old luck. Take the Armamentalist quest as an example. It required a party member to cast Wizard Ward and then deal the finishing blow to 3 metal slimes. An enemy with a high chance of running away from battle and could avoid damage extremely well in a scenario that required at least 2 turns to set up.
Do you know which class learns Wizard Ward? Mages. The starting class with the lowest attack stat.
Where'd the charm go? What happened to the fun side story involving this fully rendered 3D model? Where's the side dungeon or the special boss that used the Armamentalist moveset? You didn't get anything, just an obtuse objective and a total waste of potential, and that wasn't Dragon Quest. The side quests of Dragon Quest IX didn't fit into the identity of the series at all. They felt tacked on to appease the MMO crowd this new handheld game was expected to attract. But these were slow burn problems. They simmered, boiled, and nagged on you to drag Dragon Quest IX down. As that collective nuisance grew, the storytelling of Dragon Quest IX took a nosedive. Following traditional Dragon Quest narrative, you'd think the game would have been over after finding all 7 figs, but it didn't end there. On recovering the last fig, Aquila confronted you and asked that he return them to Apis Major himself. Due to Celestian natural order, you were powerless to refuse him, and just like you'd expect from a character who hadn't been around since the tutorial, he turned on you. Or did he? Aquila's allegiances were cloudy, and so was the third act. The introduction of an invading army that had been at war for decades and Aquila's double agency felt sudden and out of place in the narrative. A character only represented by name at the very start of the game becoming the final boss felt forced, as if the game realized there hadn't been a central antagonist to go after. If Dragon Quest IX was a different game, this wouldn't have registered. But this was a deflating storyline happening in tandem with rising grievances. It accidentally framed itself to look like the slow unraveling of a well-constructed thread. Luckily, that thread was held together by a strong core element. Tiny imperfections and last-minute fumbles weren't enough to ruin Dragon Quest IX's greatest strength.
Dragon Quest IX had the most engaging combat in the entire series.
Dragon Quest IX's combat was made to be more action-oriented. How exactly does one do that with a turn-based RPG? By adding so many factors through stats and equipment and skills that every turn refuses to play out the exact same way. Dragon Quest IX's battle system was a cut above the rest of the series because it gave enemies personality. They were capable of having several emotions during combat. They could get angry at a party member for reviving a fallen ally or landing a critical hit and target only them for a short time. They could become enthralled by characters with a high enough style and charisma stat, forcing them to skip a turn. Some bosses were even susceptible to status ailments that utterly destroyed them. Level 5 threw in practical changes to types of equipment. Staffs were renamed to wands and absorbed MP off of enemies during basic attacks, and shields all had a chance to block attacks now. Wait, what? They didn't already do that? Huh? 23 years and nobody thought about throwing that in there? Wow. Okay. Not every class could equip shields or have a high charisma stat, and additions like this provided every class with different benefits to take advantage of. Dragon Quest IX reworked how magic classes behaved, splitting magic into two different stats, magical mending and magical might. Now we had two different sets of equipment for magic casters and more room to build them down different paths. You could critical hit with magic now, even with healing spells, and the numbers behind buff and debuff spells were hidden away. Cryptic at first, but way better at telegraphing how many times any of those spells could be applied. Dragon Quest IX also got rid of outdated mechanics that plagued the series' battle system for decades. A player dying and being the only one in the group to not get experience points after a tough boss battle while the rest of their group reaped the full rewards could have incited a negative experience between friends. So in Dragon Quest IX, even dead party members earned experience if they participated in the battle. With the second screen, there was more space to provide more information to the player, so the combat HUD now displayed what each party member was going to do and who they were targeting. No more double healing someone because you forgot you already had the first character cast the spell. That happens to other people, right? It's not just me. I don't just have a terrible short-term memory. Get this though. No more random battles. For the first time in the series, monsters would now appear on screen in dungeons or the overworld and chase after you or run away depending on what level you were. For a turn-based RPG trying to be action-oriented, this was monumental. Here's why. Without random battles, players looked forward to combat. There's a huge difference between having a battle forced upon you by an invisible force and choosing to or knowing how the battle was triggered. You're running up to a chest or the exit of a room and you get hit with a random battle? Ooh, that's aggravating. You run into an enemy or start getting chased by one and can see them coming at you? Makes sense. Understandable. No big deal. With monsters visible in the world, players would actively choose to fight monsters they hadn't seen before. It allowed them to indulge in curiosity and have more control over the way they wanted to play. Personally, I think this solved a lot of balancing issues. I think people were likely to participate in battles more often simply because the decision was theirs, and that translated into them properly leveling their party, which is something the development team wanted you to do. Dragon Quest IX was supposed to be the hardest Dragon Quest ever made. Yuji Horii was quoted saying, "We made the game to be quite hard. It's harder than any of the previous titles, and the enemies are also powerful. We strengthened the bosses," stuff like that. But this was a lie, or at least unsuccessful. This monster's name is Manguini. If you named a monster in your video game Manguini, I don't think anyone's gonna be all that intimidated by it. He sounds like a giant pasta man. Dragon Quest IX wasn't difficult, and in that respect, they failed to achieve what they wanted. The effort didn't go to waste though. In their attempt to make a difficult Dragon Quest game, what they instead achieved was an exciting and transparent one. The sense of freedom Dragon Quest IX's battle system provided gave players options and added a level of uncertainty to every turn that glued their eyes to the screen. Watching one of your characters at low HP block a critical hit with their shield during a boss fight was something that made you shout excitedly. Oh my god, Mike! Mike, you fucking magical human being! You did it! Moments like that made battles memorable, and it were these changes that made those moments possible. There were new mechanics that meshed well with this concept of uncertainty. The coup de grace was a kind of super ability a character could gain related to their class in the heat of battle. They were insanely powerful abilities that could turn the tide of combat right when you needed them to, but you didn't have to use them right away. If you managed to enable the coup de grace on all 4 party members, an even more powerful ability was unlocked: the co-op de grace. Co-op de graces could grant invincibility or maximize the tension of everyone in the party. They broke the scales of balance and they weren't easy to get. Holding on to your coup de grace until you could get the co-op de grace was a big risk that yielded a big reward. They shifted your priorities in battle and had you focus on keeping different characters alive. Level 5 also added a combo multiplier for identical attacks made consecutively. It emphasized speed, and the party combinations that could abuse it would make up for the lack of variety in their abilities with raw attack damage. The psych-up system was totally reworked in Dragon Quest IX. Instead of every character being able to use their turn to raise their tension, only one person was allowed to egg them on to get the same result: you. Psyching up was replaced with the Egg On ability, a move unique to your main character, and one they couldn't use on themselves. This was a bigger investment now. It took 2 characters' turns to properly stack tension to the max, but it also let you constantly pump out low-level tension attacks one after the other. Egg On suited your main character's starting class, the Minstrel. Your character's role was not to provide healing or dish out high levels of damage. They existed to elevate the potential of party members instead of replacing the actions of those party members with their own. Oh, I wonder if that was intentional. Finally, we get to what it was all about, and by now I think you're able to put the pieces together yourself. We've been talking about authority and how to use it and the ways it can go bad. People don't need to be hand-fed or ruled over or constantly lectured to. They don't need a guardian angel to do everything for them. And I quote the game itself: "To lean on the crutch of another's power, as we have done, is to forget the honor and independence of our people." I always say Dragon Quest is about family, and Dragon Quest IX was about watching your kids grow up. The fisherman and his daughter, the king of Stornway and the princess, the almighty and the goddess. Every conflict in Dragon Quest IX dealt with the power struggle between a parent and their child. Beautifully represented by a cutscene where a tiny blue light intercepts a big red one. There was always someone rejecting the status quo, and always a remorseful authority figure coming to terms with their own intensity. For the children playing this game, this was meant as a wake-up call. It's okay for people like your parents and teachers to want to help you. It's okay to accept that help, but don't let them rule you. Don't let them do everything for you. Don't become complacent. For the parents playing Dragon Quest IX, and arguably the age group that would better understand what was being said, don't lead your flock to sin, and don't allow sin to consume you. Less metaphorically, don't forget who your children are. Now, you might not have to worry about your parents anymore. You might not be a parent. The lesson is still as potent when it comes to supporting your friends. Push them in the right direction, defend them when they can't defend themselves, be their muse if you need to, but never force them. Allow them to make mistakes. Allow them to make their own decisions. No matter how much you love them, care for them, want to protect them, and see them safe, allow them to be their own person. We've come a long way since the first Dragon Quest, haven't we? While it isn't the sophomoric single-player experience I wanted, Dragon Quest IX is pretty dope. It proved the series' versatility, showed people that it was capable of being more than a long single-player RPG and that there was more room to play around with in the formula. It was an ambitious undertaking that paid off really well despite lacking a ton of what the series was known for. On a development path, Dragon Quest VIII and IX are 2 branching paths in the same spot. 2 examples of what Dragon Quest can be. 2 deviations in the evolution of its design and where the series can go from here. I like to think Level 5 and Yuji Horí's team realized that they could explore different concepts for a Dragon Quest game and use either as jumping off points for the next one. And assuming I can get it to work, I will be covering the next one. Go ahead and ask me 1,000 times when it's coming out, I'm ready for it. But since that's up in the air and Dragon Quest XI isn't coming out in my area for a while, let's do something fun. I'm gonna rank the Dragon Quest games in order of my favorites. Dragon Quest VIII is obviously going up in the #1 spot, big surprise there. Dragon Quest IV's chapter-based storytelling and constantly changing character perspective is too good. It's also the game with Torneko Taloon in it, so it takes 2nd place, followed by Dragon Quest V. V's monster taming, its story of a heroic family unit, and the personality it brought to its characters became staples of the series. Those are the easy ones. Dragon Quest IX earns the 4th spot on the list, showing off a different kind of Dragon Quest while still retaining the series' identity. The battle system would have earned it a higher spot, but the trade-off of staple features I loved for ones that weren't that great burned me a little harder than I expected did most people. Dragon Quest III comes in at number 5. Sort of an early prototype for Dragon Quest IX, it's influenced every Dragon Quest after it in some way, and for a video game from 1988, still has a very compelling narrative. Dragon Quest II and I follow it at number 6 and 7. Time has been really kind to the first 2 Dragon Quest games, but they're still old games that exhibit old problems. Dragon Quest II is an amazing sequel, and Dragon Quest I is Dragon Quest. It's the first one, you can't hate on it. Dragon Quest VII follows them at number 8. Not a bad Dragon Quest game, but when you're 200 hours long and still have balance issues, that drags, that gets boring. I'm still mad I have to fight the final boss again for the post-game. And all the way at the bottom is Dragon Quest VI. Fuck that game, it's poopy, I don't like it.
As far as Dragon Quest goes, 8 is now second. My new favorite game is Dragon Quest XI.
That doesn't rhyme.
Dragon Quest XI opens with a familiar tale of tragedy and that small lining of hope we find wrapped around it. Ominous meetings, monsters swarming a kingdom, and the separation of a family are followed by the safety of its survivor, the warmth of a kind old man, and the feeling that things will be alright. A few years pass, and the establishing shot of our world and our main character is a slow zoom out of a marked hand holding an orange bandana as Yggdrasil floats in the distance. Ooh, that's for me! It's time for your coming of age ceremony, and that means scaling the cobblestone tour to witness the site at its summit. The path is full of monsters, and upon reaching the top, a giant bird does its best to claim your friend Gemma as its next victim. Unbeknownst to all present, it picked the wrong mountain to terrorize. A breathtaking shot of the ocean and one awkward conversation with your mother later, and it's revealed that you are the reincarnation of the Luminary, a hero born alongside the Return of the Dark One and chosen by Yggdrasil as the champion of light. You also learn that you're adopted, which personally I feel is poor timing by mom over here, though I suppose the shock of such a revelation was intentional. That never gets old. In search of answers, you make your way to the kingdom of Heliodor, based on the good faith your old grandpappy had. If there's anyone that can point you in the right direction to meeting your destiny, it's King Carnelian. You make your way through the foothills, scale the enormous city before you, and are ushered into an audience with him. King Carnelian, however, has a different take on the Luminary.
Hendrik, take this cur, this cur, this cur, this cur, this cur, this cur, this and cast him into the furthest corner of the dungeon.
You'd think, this being Dragon Quest, that there'd be more concrete in this opening cutscene. Names of people, kingdoms, some kind of sentence about prophecy. This fresh ambiguity had a purpose. Sometimes we don't have all the answers in order to make the most well-informed decisions, and that's a problem we all have to face head-on. More importantly, it was a setup. We're so used to stories that play out exactly how we expect them to in Dragon Quest. Discover we're chosen, calamity, seek out drunken royal authorities to help us on our way. King Carnelian's betrayal is a subversion of that expectation, and the somewhat harsh reality that things don't always go the way we expect them to. But non-desirable outcomes sometimes lead us to wonderful things and our greatest allies.
The name's Eric, by the way.
The juxtaposition of an orange bandana, an iconic piece of the Dragon Quest VIII character's outfit, and Yggdrasil, the focal point of Dragon Quest IX's narrative, is more than a reference. With the console and handheld game serving as two separate identities for what Dragon Quest could become, 11 was standing at a fork in the road, and it was decided, why not both? Dragon Quest XI has two versions, a handheld version reminiscent of Dragon Quest IX, and a console version like Dragon Quest VIII. This shot is more than just fan service, it's a statement. We will take the best qualities of both and combine them. We will redefine this series just like we did 14 years ago, for veteran audiences and new fans. That's a bit more than just mindless speculation. On the subject of 11, Hori told Verge that it's essentially a culmination of the series, but I also wanted this game to serve as a new starting point too. And like a call from heaven, that torch is passed down not with fire, but with lightning. Meet Dragon Quest XI's fresh-faced director, Takashi Uchikawa.
それがしは内川でござる。よろしくお願いします。
Our man Uchikawa-san was no stranger to Dragon Quest. He's been a huge fan since a child. His goal when beginning his career at Square Enix was to one day direct the mainline Dragon Quest, and he came one step closer after being brought on as Hori's scenario assistant for Dragon Quest IX. Following that, he was involved in designing Dragon Quest Monsters Joker 2 as scenario and battle coordinator. Oh, that's a long title. How do you fit that on a resume? And then his time came. Dragon Quest XI was in need of a director, and they shoved it into Uchikawa's eager hands. I bet his heart stopped and he crapped his pants right there in the office when he found out. I know I would've. Personally, I've come to like Uchikawa a whole lot. Please don't deny war crimes. Please don't deny war crimes. Please don't deny war crimes. And it's looking like the torch may have finally passed into the hands of a younger perspective that loves the series with as much passion as fans do. I'd like to show that to you throughout the next hour? Oh, I keep getting worse at being succinct. It was up to Uchikawa's team to put that lightning back into the bottle and pull a very patient audience back in. They needed to wow the crowd and make a large enough impact on the modern JRPG landscape to remind everyone who the real powerhouses were. And the way they did it? Visual fidelity. In Hori's own words, technological advancements have given us a chance to showcase the world and present it in a more lively manner. The main character still responds in a binary fashion, but the world around him feels more alive. It shouldn't matter what the game ended up looking like, of course. I'd still be here losing my mind about it, but there's a certain minimal graphical quality that Dragon Quest benefits from. Dragon Quest IX was painfully missing much of the expression and emotional impact Dragon Quest VIII delivered with its mobile character models and animated faces. The return to a more two-dimensional perspective not only highlighted how powerful fully articulate 3D models in a Dragon Quest narrative were, but the resolution of the DS... Well, let's just clarify that for the Dragon Quest IX video, I had the footage emulated at 4 times the normal resolution. Natively, you might find yourself struggling to gain an emotional attachment, and you never notice how static the towns of Dragon Quest VIII were until you broke it down for its shortcomings, something you wouldn't normally get out of me. But this was an essential component of making Dragon Quest XI a bustling world full of diverse people, analyzing the choices made in the past and adapting those choices for the present. Stepping into Heliodor is like stumbling into a fantasy metropolis. NPCs in Dragon Quest XI move. They don't stand in place anymore. They cook, they play music, they dance. Some even have routines throughout the day and take their own route around the city. These animations were accompanied by an ambitious addition. Every single NPC had their own appearance based on body and head shape, hairstyle, eyes, nose, and clothing. They all looked different. The NPC types of the past Dragon Quest games were gone, and in its place, hundreds of individuals. And I know what you're thinking. Oh god, hundreds of NPCs in a big town? I'm gonna spend hours talking to all of them and remembering what they said, and it'll never be over? I'll spend so much time on it, my wife will leave me, the alimony's gonna pile up, and I'll have to play my new favorite game from inside one of those special motels without the child blocks on the TVs! But no, 11's dev team foresaw this particular pitfall and color-coded the icons over NPC heads to denote flavor text and important hints, and made some NPCs impossible to talk to. Much like in the way Yakuza did it, many NPCs had white speech bubbles that popped up as you strolled by to add to the ambience of their location without cluttering the existing dialogue opportunities or slowing a player's progress when exploring. The decision to increase NPC volume in a town without also increasing the amount of dialogue opportunities was a clever move. Previously, players would be met with loading screens whenever they entered any of the buildings in town, but now there weren't any. Every town in Dragon Quest XI is presented to you seamlessly. You can look through windows into the insides of people's homes, let yourself in by swinging the door wide open, leaf through their private documents, and break their sentimental pottery for the baubles inside as they helplessly look on in terror. And you can do it all over again to a different family without any downtime. Without those loading screens, towns gave off the impression of having a lot more space, so throwing down more townspeople to give life to those spaces was the right move. But why build wide when they could also build tall? Don't just scale the stairs, scale the rooftops, find ladders, climb over stacks of boxes and barrels, or jump off even higher platforms to get to more items and gain access to other parts of town. Go into one building, find a second floor that leads to a roof, and then jump down a chimney into a locked room. Find secret perches or hard-to-reach balconies and figure out the means to reach them. I've always said that exploring towns makes up half of the fun of traversing Dragon Quest worlds, and in 11's vertical and uninterrupted space, you barreled through buildings and swept items off the streets like a kid clambering around a jungle gym. You felt like a tourist, a very intrusive tourist, taking in the sights and personal belongings. You were an adventurer stepping into the center of vastly unique towns with their own special landmarks, where the citizens spoke in their own special dialect and possessed different accents, with different situations and focuses. Places like Gallipolis, the city of entertainment, Gondolia, merchant capital of the world, and Honolulu, a simple fishing town with a crazy lady firing cannons into the ocean. It wasn't just about the NPCs and the kings and leaders of the crowds anymore. Hori's intent was to pay homage to an earlier Dragon Quest. That all links back to one of the big themes of Dragon Quest III, of being able to travel around the world. It's not so much a copy of the setup, but more the same idea behind it, of having the world feel real through a variety of countries and people. The towns themselves had become characters, with different means of exploring them and colorful personalities to match. In the world of Dragon Quest XI, you wholeheartedly felt like a globetrotter and were excited to advance in the narrative in order to see what new architecture was in store for you. Once you've helped Eric with some unfinished business...
Wow, nice place you got here.
Welcome, welcome. Feel free to browse. You'll find we only stock the very finest wieners.
That's good, because I'm looking for
the very finest wieners.
The two of you head back to Cobblestone to find it in ruins. Found guilty of harboring the Darkspawn, the child of light who brings with them the coming of calamity, King Carnelian ordered it razed to the ground. All hope seems lost until space-time shenanigans, and you find yourself in the past, face to face with the man who found you years ago. After explaining what's happened, he instructs you to visit Heliodor Falls, and beneath a three-sided rock, you discover a chest containing a keystone that opens the door of departure. By the skin of your teeth, you manage to reach the door and escape the clutches of the King's Guard Captain Hendrik, allowing you to search the world for the answers you need. In the new distant land of Hado, you encounter two sorcerers from Arborea, the twin sisters, Serena and Veronica, who swear allegiance to the Luminary and are charged with escorting them to meet Yggdrasil and help them destroy the Dark One. After obligatory episodic gameplay sequence, the now full-fledged party learns that the Sultan of Gallipolis possesses a branch from Yggdrasil herself, capable of forging a path to the World Tree. With your next destination determined and a goal set in place, you finally embark on your quest. That's the rough synopsis, but keep in mind these key details. The parting words your grandfather leaves you.
Remember now, don't waste your time bearing grudges, and live life with love in your heart.
Knowing that Eric's revenge turns out to be a reconciliation with his friend Dirk.
Okay. I'm sorry. I'm sorry I doubted you, partner.
That's the spirit! Eric, old pal, it's so good to have you back.
And, unlike most Dragon Quest games where revenge is a starting motivator for the narrative, the starting motivator for Dragon Quest XI's plot is understanding. Upon escaping Hendrik, your next course of action isn't make my way back to Heliodor to set the record straight. It's, I need to find the answers about myself. Heliodor only provided you with more questions, but keeping grudges won't give you the answers you're looking for. It was time to accept what's happened, and with your feet facing forward, explore new horizons to discover your destiny. In Dragon Quest XI, you travel to all sorts of different places, and the journey was as gratifying as the destination. Dragon Quest XI's overworld was full of life, rife with treasure, and a joy to navigate. Let's talk about open worlds and traversing them. Sometimes it sucks. It's a standard complaint due to how arbitrarily big some open worlds can be. Dragon Quest XI avoided this problem in a variety of ways. It kept areas from being too large, opting to minimize the space players were going to have to walk through. Then, it applied the same principles with its town design into the overworld itself. Geographical differences between regions created different patterns of movement for players. Today you're walking through a vast, open desert. Tomorrow, a narrow creek with limited footing, and the next, a wooded farmland once home to a great kingdom. Within that smaller scale, each region built upon the world. The ruins of Svardrust, the ancient structures in the Gallipolian desert, and the abandoned homes on the outskirts of Dundrasil gravitated you towards progress, treasure, and other items. Each part of this overworld was just as unique as the people and towns in it, and the constant eye candy kept players obsessed with checking every corner. Only this time, almost every corner yielded some kind of reward for having checked it. But these long stretches of nothing soured the near-perfect equation level 5 had been building. No treasure chests sprinkled about this world that was ripe for them. Material locations you found weren't marked on the map. Backtracking to pick them up was a nightmare. Sorry, I just like being validated. Dragon Quest XI made movement itself an enjoyable experience. No, I'm not talking about the jump button, but while I am, check it out, we can jump now. Isn't that cool? It's really overdue, but it's cool, right? The sprint button is a big help too, but that's only in the global release of the game, so it doesn't apply to all versions. Great addition though, seriously. Okay, so this may be the last time I get to say this, so say it with me. For the first time in the series, it's possible to ride the monsters of Dragon Quest to reach parts of the overworld you otherwise wouldn't have access to. Golden sparkle monsters walking around the world can be battled and their mounts stolen to ride over water, climb cliff sides, or even clear away rubble to reveal new areas with different monsters and more treasure chests. This helped change how players navigated areas. The means of exploration changing in different regions solidified the sense that no two areas were the same and kept each region fresh and novel. It signified the series finally understanding what made the exploration a pivotal part of going from A to B, breaking up the monotony. In addition to the monster mounting, well, forget it, that's what I called it, and that's what we're sticking to, figuratively speaking. In addition to the monster mounting, the overworld of Dragon Quest XI was full of treasure, resource spots, and a multitude of little touches to surprise its inhabitants with. Hidden crossbow targets were sprinkled across its landscape. Multiple paths made returning to areas more interesting, with different routes possessing different items or enemies. But sometimes the best way to mix up the pace of exploration is to give the player a chance to stop completely. In previous Dragon Quests, this meant returning to town, but it also meant you'd have to trudge through known sections again. Uchikawa's team acknowledged players' needs and cut out the middleman entirely, successfully removing one of the more annoying contrivances that had plagued the series. They added camps, a way to save your game, heal your party, and buy items without having to go through those repetitive motions. Camps dotted the landscape but were spaced out far enough to still create those treks of trials and tribulations, especially in dungeons. Because they were stationary, players were given a stronger sense of rest. Used to be you were spamming buttons and bumping into townsfolk. That's not a break. That doesn't sound like a break to me. That sounds more like having to run errands right in the middle of doing something fun. You sat in these camps and you realized how stressful it used to be to evac out, zoom to the town, run to the inn, run to the shops, run to the church, sometimes on opposite sides of the town, and then walk through the whole dungeon again. At a camp, the night falls. Soft music begins to play. Your party members huddle together by the fire and socialize. In that moment, everything stops. You can breathe, and for once, you don't have to worry about the what-ifs. What if I left right before a boss? What if my party wipes because I didn't go back to heal? What if I run out of storage space while I'm playing and my hard drive corrupts and I lose the footage to this great boss fight? Well, at that point, you give up and never finish your retrospective series. The point is, you finally had time to appreciate the progress you'd made, a cathartic moment of accepting all that had happened. But even now, the thought pours into your mind.
GC is such a pretentious dirtbag.
Okay, fair, but the thought after that, the one that begs the question, how can this really be such a significant break? This whole process would take a few seconds, so how would it genuinely create enough time for players to get into a form of relaxation? Because camps were a new location to conduct a new form of alchemy. Moving alchemy away from its static location in 9, but keeping players from accessing it freely like in 8 was a smart change that gave the process of alchemy proper significance. For one, it kept players from constantly looking at their inventories. This was a nasty habit that created tedium and slowed down progress as players checked and double-checked for alchemy ingredients. For another, it allowed players to access alchemy in places they previously couldn't. Because even dungeons had camps, players had even less reason to throw away their progress now. This was a power move that added a huge deal of agency to Dragon Quest and restructured the gameplay loop. forward momentum was maintained without forcing the player to be in a constant and repetitive state of motion. Alchemy itself was completely reworked in Dragon Quest XI, and it's the best it's ever been. You're gonna hear that a lot. It might as well be the tagline of the game. Using recipes was now mandatory. Losing the ability to mix and match ingredients manually to acquire powerful gear early was a slight bummer, but this change ultimately increased the desire to search bookshelves for new recipes, which resulted in players reading a lot more flavor text and engrossing themselves in the lore of the world. And it became a fully fledged minigame of its own. Why do I have so many live-action cutaways in this section?
Behold, the fun-size forge. Pop a few raw materials on top, bash them with the porta pounder, and behold, new equipment.
Depending on the item you were forging, a pattern would form separated into a grid of squares. Each square represented one part of the item and had a meter attached with a sweet spot highlighted in green. The goal of forging was to hammer those squares and aim for each sweet spot. The more sweet spots you managed to hit, the better quality of item you made. But it wasn't so simple. Each bash of your hammer used up a certain amount of focus, and once you were out of focus, you were done. For better or worse. Failing to create an item from scratch wasn't an option. Even if you did screw it up big time, that item was yours. Any forging deemed a success, though, gave you perfectionist pearls that you could then use to rework your equipment. Forging made alchemy an activity to look forward to, and a diversion from the core gameplay much in the same way monster taming was in earlier Dragon Quests. It was a breather that still served what you were in the middle of doing, giving you a slower pace to ruminate as you pumped and primed your gear for the boss fight ahead. And it wasn't a one-dimensional feature that became tedious over time. The better the gear, the harder it was to create. You had to watch the temperature of the forge as well, since each bash made the forge colder and your bashes weaker. And to top it off, the more powerful equipment possessed the possibility of popping off surprise conditions while you were working on them. These ranged from lowering the condition of squares on the grid to increasing the focus cost of your next bash for an added critical hit chance. Your skill in forging grew alongside your main character's combat level, so the stronger you became, the more focus you had at your disposal and the more special techniques you developed. Things like reheating the forge to keep the strength of your bashes up, double whammies that contained the strength of 2 bashes for less focus, and bashes that covered greater surface areas were a necessity for later recipes. I've come up with a new recipe! That's the wrong series. This was a great way to balance out the possible gear you could end up having at certain points in the game without making it impossible for more savvy players to skillfully manipulate the forge at lower levels for advantageous equipment. You could try to forge a +3 weapon for a large boost to your stats, or fail spectacularly and still receive a weapon with marginally better attack power than your current weapon, but lose the ingredients and therefore have to spend perfectionist pearls to rework it up to +3 instead. And unlike your first time forging items, failing at reworking them meant no upgrade and a loss of pearls. This management of resources made alchemy less of a quick-as-you-can mechanic and one that required more consideration for timing. Maybe it'd be better to hold on to those pearls for a better item you might find. Maybe wait a couple of levels to ensure a perfect forging for a cheaper way to get those bigger boosts. Maybe you could use the smaller boosts or those status ailment protections right now, or maybe you're feeling confident about your forging technique. With forge items becoming more difficult to successfully make as your repertoire of flourishes and capacity to focus grew, alchemy in Dragon Quest XI became a series of puzzles to solve. Almost its own side quest that you slowly chipped away at over the course of the game, the outcome of which affected how players would equip their party and behave in battle. Speaking of side quests, those are back too. And thankfully, a lot better. Side quests in Dragon Quest IX were tedious, arbitrarily convoluted, and unnecessarily specific. Side quests don't need to be easy or consisting of short-term goals, but if Uchikawa's team wanted to address the flaws of side quests past, a more concentrated set of objectives was needed. In 11, they had the sense to keep any important or significantly game-changing items out of possible side quest rewards. They also removed the limitation of only being able to take one side quest at a time. With these changes, side quests came off as extra challenges you could take with tantalizing rewards like new alchemy recipes or special gear, only without the bizarre restrictions Dragon Quest IX placed upon you for seemingly no reason. They were able to be completed at your leisure, and instead of the reward being some piece of locked content like a new job class or crazy dungeon, The objectives of these side quests pointed you in the direction of mechanics or content you might not have realized existed. It helped that side quests which were able to be accessed became active in your menu with directions on how to start them as well. This is the real power of side quests and challenges, not unlocking new content by rewarding it, but exposing players to said content by nature. Take, for instance, this casino side quest, pointing me in the direction of a second casino I didn't know existed. You had to win the jackpot on roulette though. I don't know, that seems pretty hard. Putting my flex aside, side quests, alchemy, and overworld exploration belong to a greater spread of those secondary features we came to expect and enjoy from Dragon Quest. In 11, our old favorites make a return shiny and polished, bringing with them new ideas and new activities. New to the casinos was Slime Quest, a slightly different take on slot machines that mixed in elements of pachinko and allowed manual stopping of slot reels. Slime Quest had a fun visual novelty with lots of special reels and win conditions. Winning reliably, however, depended on keeping a close eye on the machine payouts and odds. In Dragon Quest XI, casino employees filled you in on which machines were paying out, which machines just finished dispensing jackpots, and the assorted odds each machine had. These were always changing, so biding your time for better odds and higher payouts was a way of playing against the chance nature of the casinos. You could also slight this poor man who spent all night on his stack of cards.
Just as flimsy as the marriage that drove you here, Randy.
Our wonderful mini-medals were in full effect. Did they use a progression system this time where collecting a certain amount of mini-medals earned you prizes, or the shop version where you spent medals on a selection of rare items?
Yes.
Once you cleared the mini-medal track, the mini-medal shop became available, with new alchemy recipes and rare alchemy ingredients for purchase. Mini-medals were in large abundance now, so there was no need to worry about not finding them all. Some enemies could drop them, and other activities practically gave them away late game. You would complete your book of medals and open the shop eventually. Dragon Quest XI also added horse racing to its repertoire. Yeah, horse racing. I know, right out of left field. I don't understand whose idea that was. I think someone's gambling addiction has gotten worse. Each race got progressively more difficult and challenging, requiring you to balance your horse's stamina against various stamina pickups and obstacles. The longer you could keep your horse sprinting, the more distance you could build between you and the other racers. What horse racing lacked was variety in its stages. Of the 5 you could eventually race in, only one had a gimmick beyond being a different shape than the others. Otherwise, it was always the same location, the same obstacles, and the same tricks to get ahead. The shape of the tracks didn't change drastically enough to make each race feel all that different. More would only unlock after plot progression 2, meaning you'd have to awkwardly check in to see if there was a new track you could spend 5 to 10 minutes on. It was a ton of fun, but short-lived in a 100-hour RPG. And speaking of short-lived, let's talk about what isn't in Dragon Quest XI and how they retooled the ideas behind them.
I'm a big mad baby because they didn't put monster taming in the game.
This overworld was huge and detailed. I mean, look, the enemies on the map have behavioral patterns depending on the time of day and weather. With the ability to get this specific with enemy behavior on maps as geographically diverse as this, the presence of infamous monsters or even special bosses was sorely missed. You fight some of these designs and wish you could tame them. You walk into these beautiful clearings and your only thought was, oh, this would have been a perfect place for a boss fight. There was still something that invoked the spirit of the monster arena though, the Wheel of Harma. The Wheel of Harma is a series of challenges of varying rank that pit you against different groups of monsters and That sounds familiar. Without monster taming, it was your party that needed to face the challenges of the wheel, but with a twist. You had to select which party members were going to attempt each part of the gauntlet before you started. And to make things more interesting, your performance wasn't graded on whether or not you completed each rank, but on the number of turns it took you to finish. Kinda like sex. Because you had total control over your party in these trials, the monsters you faced weren't so cut and dry. There were multiple solutions to winning, especially under the turn limits you were trying to avoid reaching. You just had to be clever and use your party intelligently. The Wheel of Harma might not have been the monster arena we love, but the principles were the same. Understanding the challenges in front of you and knowing how to utilize the options you had when forming teams for each battle. It was invigorating when you were able to solve one, only to get hung on the next in the trial and have to brainstorm that for a while. And after finally figuring out a combination of party members and moves to beat all the battles in one trial, think of a way to complete the whole thing in under a certain amount of turns. It was all about optimizing your playstyle against particular enemies. Once you could beat them consistently, you felt like a master strategist. Like horse racing though, the Wheel of Harma wasn't something you could access alongside the main path and jump back to when you felt strong enough to beat one of the ranks. You didn't unlock the Wheel of Harma until at least 70 hours in, and I'm being generous. That was something the Monster Arena brought to the deviations of Dragon Quest that went missing in 11. Cohesion. With all the extra activities to do in Dragon Quest XI, there wasn't a standout option for players looking for fun side stories or quest chains that built upon any one place or contributed to your overall experience in a big way. There were no stories about a saber cat and his busy master, no inns you could help upgrade over time, no men with Italian accents asking you to
play with yourself, eh?
11's side content was opted to be bite-sized in the form of side quests and mini-medals, or isolated like the Wheel of Harma and the Casino. That's not to say Dragon Quest XI was missing that cohesion, only that for certain elements outside of the core components, there was little to anchor them together. In reality, Dragon Quest XI is almost assuredly the most cohesive of the bunch. Now, maybe missing some golden oldies, but it could never be without our favorite traditions. Time to boat in Dragon Quest XI is about 17 hours depending on your circumstances, and for you, the circumstances were about to get fabulous.
Who, me? Don't be ridiculous, darling. I'm just a silly old jester.
In Gallopolis, the party meets the kingdom's prince, who desperately asks for their assistance in the coming horse race, marking his coming of age. Fearing the fallout if he fails to win and revealing he has shirked his training, he offers the rainbow in return for your help. Disguising yourself in his riding gear, you participate as the prince's double, winning the competition and the attention of the great Sylvando.
Wait, don't tell me you were... Surely you didn't let your understudy take the stage for the command performance? Oh, this is too good!
An exchange about ideals later and the consequences of the prince's actions bear fruit. Before you can receive your reward, an accursed creature known to the kingdom as the Slayer of the Sands attacks Gallopolis. Prince Ferris's worst nightmare is made reality when his father, the Sultan, charges him with defeating the beast.
Please, I beg of you, the Slayer of the Sands will tear me limb from limb unless you aid me. Have pity on the desperate soul. Oh.
Sylvando's kindness and curiosity convinces him to assist you.
Look, I'm worried about the half-wit prince getting himself killed. Can I come with you or not? At least one of you has some sense. Lead on, darling!
Together, you journey to the Celestial Sands and make camp for the night, where Sylvando learns about your journey.
Meow. So there's a dastardly villain coming to steal all the smiles and laughter from the world.
You vanquished the Slayer of the Sands, returned to Gallopolis, and a certain prince learned a certain lesson about resolve.
Repeat after me now. A knight's word?
A knight's word is his bond. His kingdom, his master.
Well, don't stop.
And after all of that, the search for the rainbow sent you across the sea to the city of Octagonia, with one problem. You didn't own a boat. Thankfully, a certain silly old jester was in possession of one, and had become quite enamored with your quest.
Oh, don't be coy, darling. I want to come with you, of course. You should never have told me about your heroic quest if you didn't want me to tag along.
What are you talking about? You can't just decide to come with us. This isn't a game.
The prince's plight is juvenile, but not without merit. A telltale result of fearing expectations and the consequences of the actions we take.
But the more I fulfilled them, the more their expectations grew. And now, finally, they expect the impossible. It's so unfair.
He's got half of the lesson we're focusing on today, and he's almost got it, but not quite. Note Fartface's deterrence in acknowledging his actions, despite understanding how he got himself into the situation. His fixation on his past choices steadily escalated his problem into something seemingly impossible to solve. Prince Farfuga is someone straddled by the weight on his shoulders, second-guessing his past so much that he cannot face the present. Rather than live with his choices, Fettuccini builds on his own lies. He chains down the consequences until they eventually come crashing down upon him, and he is faced with a choice he is absolutely paralyzed by. That is, until the great Sylvando reminds him of the knight's pledge.
He serves the weak untiringly, challenges the strong unflinchingly, and never retreats in the face of adversity.
The Knight's Pledge complements Old Chalky's advice about living life with love in your heart and not bearing grudges, to face down the challenges ahead of you without hesitation, to live by your word, to act with resolve. But even the great Sylvando, with his strength and living in the present, has a past he isn't exactly all that satisfied with.
What about you, Sylvando? What made you leave home and set out on the road?
Oh, you don't want to hear my boring old stories. We've got a big day ahead of us tomorrow. Come on, kiddies. Betty buys.
This isn't to shut down the ideal Sylvando upholds. It's meant to display that everyone at any point in their lives, regardless of circumstance, is faced with difficult decisions and the sense of regret or unknown that comes with not taking the other option. With access to a boat, Dragon Quest XI remained a linear experience. We were stuck behind a floodgate. This was a smart move, though.
Didn't you complain about this in your Dragon Quest VI video?
It's different. Dragon Quest VI was this messy, poopy narrative that said no to you without reason. It landlocked you after making the promise of open waters. Dragon Quest XI was focused, pointing you directly to areas you could dock at within the space you could sail, and made it clear what your destination was. The floodgate didn't matter because players had enough information about their next goal before getting the boat. That limited space made sense. No promises were made. Clarity was obtained. Bad. Good. Poopy game. Good game. You. Yay. The rest of the sea was open to you, and it was clear that vehicle traversal had changed significantly. The ability to dock anywhere was reduced to only specific points on the map, labeled by anchors and bird-eagle symbols? I forgot what they looked like, and I'm too lazy to check. Hey, don't look at me like that. This was disappointing to discover, but it made sense given how much bigger the overworld of Dragon Quest XI was and how you were meant to explore it. Having anchor points for players to start from limited the problem of stumbling onto a camp too soon for it to be practical. It also gave the level design more freedom to create the diverse geography in each area you went to. Without those anchor points, areas would have had to have been flatter to compensate for players being able to dock anywhere, a problem avoided by older entries expressing terrain on a flat 2D plane, and a problem later entries exhibited by having one type of traversable region. Green, with the trees, maybe some beige, a cow once in a while. Hey, check it out, I'm like Bob Ross. All those routes and fun architecture would be lost in a world built towards that old convenience. There was a balancing act going on. Convenience is removed to open the way for new ideas and important quality of life additions that simplify traditional experiences to build upon existing mechanics. For veterans of the series, this would be most evident in Dragon Quest XI's combat. Combat in 11 had been fine-tuned into a beautiful spectacle of quick thinking and adaptive strategy. Enemies of the same type were now appropriately grouped together. No more two slimes sandwiched between a couple of bunnies. If it's the same enemy type, they were all targetable together. This simplification increased the value of group targeting abilities and expedited battles that previously ran long in the tooth due to awkward targeting options. If you were using a boomerang or other weapon that hit multiple enemies, you could choose which individual enemy you wanted to start with in the chain. The weapon would start there and go to the right until it hit all the targets. This was another small change that gave players the flexibility to focus the weaker enemies in a group and manipulate the cascading damage intelligently. It helped maintain the advantages that enemies of the same type being in separate groups previously offered as well. You no longer needed to have equipment prepped in a character's inventory, as every party member had access to an equipment bag that stored all weapons, armor, and accessories. It was accessible in battle, making on-the-fly changes to your character's loadout easier. It also opened up space for more healing and special items in character inventories. Using the item still required that character to hold it though. This prevented players from abusing special effects in battle, creating a balance between inventories and the equipment bag. And there were two camera options for battles. The action camera allowed free movement, which let players create the illusion of tactical positioning. But that's all it was, an illusion. The action camera wasn't anything special. It took too much away from the speed of battles and lost its charm once you realized you couldn't actually dodge attacks with it. The classic option was the camera we're all familiar with, only this time with added camera angles and more cuts to make battles feel intense and provide better hit feedback on attacks. Those make up the extent of smaller improvements, but there's more to cover. Hori and Uchikawa weren't blind to the ideas of their peers. It'd be silly to build this new start for the series without being conscious of basic fundamentals other RPGs had introduced, and I quote, "The way we approached Dragon Quest XI was the idea that it needs to be approachable and ease of access, just making the game easier to play and easier to get into. Those kind of playability touches are things we have taken from other games. One of those staples being preemptive attacks in the overworld. This was straightforward, run up and slap the thing for bonus damage. It's worth understanding the real boon this mechanic added though. Removing the random battles from Dragon Quest was great, but to initiate combat, you just, you threw yourself at them like a carton of eggs at a brick wall. That's weird, right? There's no real interaction or feedback. This added them and created a compelling urge to smack as many monsters as you could. Whack, whack, whack. Monsters on the map cut out the anxiety of random battles. Preemptive swings transitioned the choice to battle into the urge to battle. More importantly, Dragon Quest XI, the console version at least, changed the way turns were taken in combat. You no longer pre-selected the entire party's actions all at once at the start of the round. Turns were now taken when it was that character's time to act. Alright, not a huge deal when you look at the general landscape of RPGs nowadays, but consider what that change meant for Dragon Quest. Previously, part of the strategy element was foreseeing damage before it happened. Heals you set up for that turn were taking into account potential damage you could receive before the heal went off, as well as whatever damage you took last turn. The shift in the way actions were taken pulled the Dragon Quest audience out of their comfort zones. In this series' case, people tend to play safely, and this leads players into the repetitive action many detractors of turn-based RPGs fall into, and rightly so. Fact is, turn-based RPGs can get really boring when you play it safe. But now you didn't need to play it safe. You couldn't, could ya? Serena won't be able to heal you until her turn comes up, so forget any just-in-case healing. And you could use your main character to heal right now, but that's going to waste an attack and Serena might have to heal anyway. Dragon Quest's combat had become more reactionary. It was now about acting in the moment. It went from being padded with whole rounds of healing to having a stronger flow that encouraged playing the character's strengths and taking more risks. A combat system like that was going to need a lot of dynamics. It needed an abundance of abilities to entice its players into taking the risks, and it had to create the circumstances that made exploring those characters necessary. And why reinvent the wheel when you already perfected it decades ago? Dragon Quest IV's party system was back and in full force. Like in 4, plenty of battles in 11 were having you switching between characters to gain an advantage. Sometimes you had no other choice. Throughout the narrative, your cast of party members were separated and rearranged, forcing you to learn the ins and outs of each of them, and discover some interesting combos in the process. To quote Uchikawa, "We didn't want a situation where players are ensured victory by using a particular character, and we wanted to avoid that type of strategy being generated." You could stack ailments with Sylvando and then have Eric capitalize by using his dagger skills to deal triple damage on poisoned enemies. But let's say Eric wasn't available or you had a different kind of strategy in mind. With Veronica instead, Sylvando could be used as a battery, buffing her to make her spells more powerful. Being able to switch out party members at the cost of a turn was a returning feature that further encouraged learning more combinations, and the alternating availability of your party members posed a nifty challenge to players that also opened their eyes to each character's potential. The setup and paying off of these combos was reminiscent of the same strategies revolving the Psych Up mechanic. Psyching Up was an enemy-exclusive function now, and a huge threat against your party when an enemy began to use it, but both players and enemies had an even greater ace up their sleeve, and it involved a new mechanic built off of the coup de grace from Dragon Quest IX, pep powers. Like coup de grace, pep powers triggered for all sorts of reasons. They were more than an opportunity to get off a powerful move though, much more. Characters that pepped up in battle could carry their pep over into other battles, and, if you wanted to, store that pep for later by removing the character from the active party. Why hold on to peps across multiple battles? For one, saving it for a tougher enemy was a smart move, but being pepped up also boosted all of that character's stats for its duration, which meant you weren't only waiting for the right time to use it, you were milking the buffs for what they were worth and rotating party members out to use them later. That pushed new combos into your lap and changed your strategy as the dynamic of battles shifted. Pep powers didn't stop there, no. Pep powers also required specific characters to be pepped up to use them, and there were no substitutions or repeat abilities between the party. Some of them could be used by one pepped up character as long as the other characters necessary were in the active party, but the majority of pep powers had their own special animations involving multiple pepped up party members, and did specific things based on their personalities or powers. An ability where the hero and Sylvando performed a daring circus act to rally everyone's attack power, a powerful healing sigil using Serena that cured all ailments and topped off health, and my personal favorite, turning Eric into a supercharged 2-turn having demon that could deal massive damage. Yeah, he's so cool, I love him! With pep powers, the balancing we love to talk about in Dragon Quest was given that much more depth without breaking those keep it simple design values the series adheres to. Players would end up with vastly different party configurations, trying to save up pep for their favorite powers, and use abilities or strategies they'd never consider otherwise. Every new party member acquired didn't just mean one more list of abilities to choose from. Every new party member meant more pep powers, more equipment to forge, more synergies to uncover, and more skill points to spend. And surprise, it's the best it's ever been! The skill point system returned! It looked at Dragon Quest IX's job system and said, no offense, but I don't like you. And then it beat the job system up and nuzzled itself into Dragon Quest's arms. But it had been some time since the skill point system wasn't sharing that embrace with some other mechanic. It was different, changed. I mean, butt stuff was completely out of the question, and they'd never agree on the viscosity of the latex anymore. The relationship would never be the same way again. Because it was better! Gone were the days of dumping points into a stat on level up and unlocking things in a linear fashion. Introducing the skill point hexagon panel thingy. Yeah, every character possessed their own skill panel grid, and on it were several sections dedicated to their equipable weapons and 1 or 2 personal traits. As a luminary, you had sections of the grid dedicated to your prophetic powers, but you also possessed a section in sword mastery that lay adjacent to sword and greatsword sections, for example. Instead of putting them into these categories, you spent skill points on panels adjacent to any panels you had already unlocked, starting from the center. The skill panel grid was a genius innovation that solved an issue with skill-based progression that not 11's contemporaries nor other games in general could: the begrudging linearity of unlocking new skills. Because all the panels were side by side on the grid, it was possible to build around the panels you didn't want to waste points on. If the first panel for swords didn't pique your fancy, you could take the one underneath it to get to the panels adjacent to them. If you wanted to rush down an entire section of dagger abilities for Eric to unlock dual wield, you could ignore all the excess panels that weren't going to get you to your goal. And finding the fastest path to those desired skills was often ideal. Some panels had passive abilities or flat stat bonuses regardless of weapon choice, making joint skill routes exceptionally powerful. With the grid in place, you weren't limited to whatever those skill trees had to offer. You could skip options you weren't going to use, pick up a couple passives from another tree on your way to something important, and because every panel had a specific cost associated with it, a balance was still able to be maintained. Given that pricing, one level up can net you multiple skills instead of one. Buy the cheaper panels you can afford on leveling up, or save your skill points for that big ability, but play with a limited skill set for the time being. The choice was yours, and options at your disposal were tempting. Not just because every panel could find a home in some player's combat lexicon, but also because panels were marked when they were components to unlocking brand new pep powers, or could surprise you with bonus skill points to further character development. With all these factors at play, it was difficult to find any party builds that were done exactly the same. Talking to friends who were playing alongside me, it was great discovering we had all gone down different paths. I took Eric down a boomerang dagger hybrid path, but someone else took him straight down swords instead. My luminary never touched great swords, but I had a friend that played his luminary exclusively with them. And if I had wanted to try out their builds for curiosity's sake, the process was simple. You could reallocate all of any and every character's points at any save location for a moderate amount of gold. You weren't being held down by the decisions you'd made in the past with the skill point system, just as you weren't trying to predict too far into the future in combat. Everything was built to convey a relaxed confidence, alternatively, an indomitable resolve. The moment-to-moment thinking, the attraction to risky actions, and the peace of mind knowing you had full control over the secondary functions made combat in Dragon Quest XI the kind of experience that left you smiling, sometimes smug over a satisfying success. Uchikawa put it the best. The core aspects I outlined to determine whether something is Dragon Quest-like are that it's easy to comprehend, generates a sense of comfort, and a sense of adventure that gets you excited. We would start by checking ideas against these three pillars and make a judgment call based on that.
And it also made everything feel extremely easy.
Let's review. Enemies were grouped together more often, making them easier to target. You had more inventory space for special or healing items and could equip whatever, whenever. You could deal bonus damage before a battle started, and because of that, you were getting into more fights more often, which means more XP for the party. Pep powers could carry over into other battles, and you had total freedom over every character's skill development. Yeah, when you put it that way, it's not surprising. In my case, it took a good 80 hours before I finally had my first party wipe. I had close calls up to that point, but nothing I couldn't handle. But wait, what if I told you that, in this case, easy was better? What if this is what Dragon Quest is when you trim the fat? When you create an environment for players to experiment? Fans of Dragon Quest are accustomed to remembering the tougher aspects of Dragon Quest battles. But you've been on this ride with me. We've covered every other
single-player
Dragon Quest game on this show, and the ones at the top of the list are some of the easier ones. The entries that played around with the fundamentals of its combat, the ones that added entirely new progression systems, the ones that had unorthodox party management. The Dragon Quest games with the most entertaining combat tend to be the easier ones. They strip away the humdrum rhythm of turn-based RPGs and add a personality to what players are doing. Because of that, players get invested in how they're utilizing the tools on hand, and instead of doing the bare minimum to succeed, get good at using them. And 11 takes those tools directly from these games. It takes the team-up concepts from 9, it takes the progression system from 8, and it takes the party system from 4. At the same time, it does away with old and frustrating design, instead adding incentive after incentive to engage in battles as often as possible and without fear of having to backtrack because of it. 11 so readily exposed you to new options and challenges that you quickly garnered a mastery over them. And for what it's worth, it's not that easy. Never having to heal is easy. Having the optimal strategy remain the same across every battle is easy. Being put into situations that ask you to play differently, having the materials to do that well, that's not easy, it's just good. It could also be that we've all amassed 1,000 hours playing these games and have become the equivalent of unleashing a pack of lions on a kindergarten class. But I'm a romantic, so stirring, impassioned speech it is. That wasn't the only adventurous aspect of Dragon Quest XI. Uchikawa might have been in charge of combat, but Yuji Horii was still the designer and scenario writer, and if I told you the narrative of Dragon Quest XI was full of unexpected twists, thought-provoking subtext that stuck with you, and endeavors into empathy previously unknown to the series, would you believe me? Because that's what I'm about to tell you. Not entirely sure how I'm supposed to go about this without using spoilers, but we'll cross that road when and if we get there. Dragon Quest XI's narrative stretches out over 120 hours and 3 different world states. Something that long was in danger of being slow, and worse, boring. Dragon Quest VII was a long tale that spanned roughly the same amount of time, and by God, that was exhausting. Horii has wisened up since then, like deciding to hire other writers to help with secondary dialogue kinds of wisened up. Up until Dragon Quest VIII, Horii had done every piece of text in the game by himself. But the master storyteller hadn't lost his edge. Despite its length, Dragon Quest XI had some of the best pacing of the series, along with some of its greatest takeaways, if not the greatest one. Like always, 11's narrative behaved like the collection of episodes Dragon Quest stories tend to be. Arriving to a new town was akin to the start of a new episode, but especially so in 11. Thanks to the way NPCs were now being designed, minor characters that previously would only be distinguishable by their named text box now possessed unique appearances. Even those tertiary characters that looked as if their appearances were made with those general assembly parts still stood out and were recognizable beside their neighbors. It gave an added sense of novelty to any story development. These were characters you'd remember for their stories, and they helped further modulate each new episode of the narrative. We really built out unique characters for Dragon Quest XI, and in that sense, even if people don't remember the story, we feel like the characters will really stick in their minds. 11 also introduced the structural blocking that 7 was lacking. Seasons. Structural block? This is why I don't talk about movies. I don't know what the hell I'm talking about. I'm a fraud. I'm a loser. I'm a joke. Nobody cares. 11 was a self-contained trilogy, with each figurative season marking a significant change in the state of the world, the state of your character, and of the enemies and towns you were visiting. Season 1 was about the assembling of the party, understanding your goal and the method you were going to complete it with. Season 2 was about getting to know that party, understanding their motivations, getting to know their interpersonal relationships, and marked a surprising shift in Dragon Quest's narrative tone. Season 1 lulls you into this false sense of security, like you're going to be playing through that good old typical Dragon Quest narrative, and then Horii rips that blanket away from you, disrupts that beautiful sense of triumph you were about to grasp, and squishes your heart with a soul-crushing scene. Yeesh, a far cry from the wholesome tales and distant melancholy we were used to. This was dire. This was messed up, and it didn't pull any punches from then on. Interviews with Horii and Uchikawa would stress how different the story they wanted to tell was, and admittedly, I doubted it. But Dragon Quest XI was different. It took narrative risks, went for calculated moments of melodrama, showed vulnerability in its characters, and knew how and when to brutally hit you with death, doubt, and an uneasy feeling that made you think, could I have done that better? And that's an intentional step Dragon Quest XI took into imparting its morsels of wisdom. Not just telling you how to deal with a particular facet of living, but putting those feelings in your heart, taking you to that place in your mind and showing you what the sensation they were describing felt like. To many people, Dragon Quest XI is going to look like a drastic shift in storytelling for the series. It may seem like the darker elements within the story are an attempt at being gritty or intense. It's anything but.
Really, a lot of the weight behind Dragon Quest XI's themes, and why so much of it pays homage and celebrates previous entries, comes from its lineage. It is the tale of father and child over the course of 30 years, a final chapter in one person's life marking the beginning of a new chapter in another's. And if you've played all the Dragon Quests up until now, you'll be surprised to discover you know that story pretty well.
The year is 1986, and Dragon Quest I has just released in Japan for the Famicom. In it, players take on the role of the descendant of Erdrick, taking up his mantle, his weapons, his armor. You are tasked with defeating an evil like your ancestor before you, making the world a better place. This story begins with meeting expectations, properly carrying on in footsteps left before this fledgling adult about to take their first steps alone. Dragon Quest I is a solitary tale of unknowns, the beginning of one's independent life. In Dragon Quest II, that person finds others like them, people who are beginning their adventure after losing their parents or leaving the nest. Finding comfort in companionship, they form a bond. They work together to meet the pressures they found placed upon them head on. Unifying their resolve, Dragon Quest II marks this person's first moment of clarity, that they're not alone in this journey, that many people share their anxieties and mission. They find comfort in the companionship, maybe even fall in love once in a while, as they continue trying to make their ancestry proud. Until in Dragon Quest III, when it becomes clear that living in the shadow of their parents isn't enough. At this point, our protagonist has made many friends and learned a great deal about themselves in the process. They begin to fight their way out of their ancestor's shadow and emerge victorious, creating a legend of their own, and gaining the title of Erdrick in the process. From trying to honor Erdrick, to escaping his shadow, to becoming Erdrick themselves, our hero finally realizes the weight of their responsibility, what they will represent to their descendants, and the power they have in preparing them for their moment of actualization. Dragon Quest IV is that plan of preparation mechanically, as all the characters in the chapters leading up to the hero's introduction lay the groundwork for their success. Our protagonist in this odyssey is not the hero of Dragon Quest IV, but the rest of the party, having made all the necessary plans for the future of a child that may not even exist yet, but knowing that there will come a day when they are no longer able to help. And in Dragon Quest V, that fear is made tenfold when our hero loses their beloved father. That sudden realization of mortality and the grief in losing the man they so desperately fought to separate themselves from, it's earth-shattering. The protagonist of Dragon Quest has a second epiphany. They are not the chosen one. They are not the most important person in this world. This opens their mind to empathy and compassion. They are able to form deeper connections with their loved ones. They get married, they have children, and for our main character, their children are the chosen ones. Their children are who matter, who deserve to wear the mantle and the weapons and the armor. And so the son becomes the father and begins to truly appreciate all that was done for them. History begs to repeat itself, a possibility they are all too fearful of. Dragon Quest VI explores this identity crisis. Call it existential or call it a result of our new father reaching their middle age. Regardless, VI discusses the duality of our hero. Someone of two minds split between their own desires and their responsibilities. The presence of two worlds representing fantasy and reality for the characters in it symbolize the struggle our father has in balancing these things. But the dual nature of the characters within those worlds also represent the father's relationship with their child. The person they want to be, who they used to be, past glories and old attitudes that held strongly onto childhood dreams, these fantasies of a different time are real in the minds of their child. But what may come to pass, the experience of hardships and the power of hindsight, this is the father's reality. Given the deconstruction of the fantasies within the game's narrative and what we know of the father's own experiences, we know all we need to of their choices in the matter. In Dragon Quest VII, the rigid structure beats out the temptations of desire, a lesson the father attempts to pass on to the child, who naturally rebels. Maribel sneaks out at night. Prince Kiefer runs away and settles down with someone his father would disapprove of. The main character of VII explores ruins he was told not to go near, and they eventually rebel against even God himself. And here's where the shift happens, where suddenly the main characters do not represent the father, but the child. where the lessons to learn and the revelations made are from the perspective of the parent to their child. VII's ultimate contribution to our story lies in the ending. The main character, despite the influence of his friends and his rebellious attitude, always returns home and joins the family business. The father, having become an authority figure, represented by the omnipotent forces in the story, is essentially making a stubborn point. Rebel all you want, live your youth against the grain, denounce me and the things I'm telling you, eventually you'll see it my way. Arrogance comes back in a major way. Before history can repeat itself, however, we see tiny cracks of doubt, of remorse. The God of Seven turning out to be a villain in disguise, Prince Kiefer's father understanding his son's decision, the newfound independence and freedom many characters earn in Seven's extensive tale. These parallels culminated into a rocky relationship between father and child, marked by awkward conversations and heated moments. Dragon Quest VIII expands on this relationship. It questions the motives of the father, shown in the many ways the narrative's parental figures fail to understand the plight of their children and the problematic behaviors they are unknowingly subjecting them to. King Clavius's failure to raise his son out of being a spoiled brat, Domenico's total mistreatment of David, and Jessica's tenuous relationship with her mother. It is both an acknowledgement of the father's mistakes and an acceptance that a parent's responsibility to their child is not to ensure they are better off, successful, or protected from their own mistakes. A parent's responsibility to their child is ensuring that they are happy.
Old obligations matter not one jot. What matters is being able to live a full and happy life.
And in line with our takeaway from 8, it's also the child's own discovery of companions and like-minded individuals pursuing similar interests. Less a rebel and now simply their own person old enough to choose for themselves, they've grown to learn a new definition of family. Perhaps realizing their mistakes, seeing their child grown up into their own person, fearing the loss of their connection, or a little bit of all three, the father seeks forgiveness in Dragon Quest IX. 9, where a home is broken and its inhabitants scattered, where a mentor, thinking he knows better, lashes out at his pupil and ultimately sacrifices himself to save their life, where potential figures throughout the narrative apologize to their children for their ignorance, where the Celestrians, those otherworldly beings with a superior attitude that watch over silly mortals, ascend to heaven, understanding that the humans they coddled are perfectly capable of protecting themselves. Dragon Quest IX is about the father admitting he was wrong, about the child struggling to emerge from the shadow of their parents. The similarities in how parties are structured between 9 and 3, as well as the multiplayer components reinforcing the union of people, certainly do this metaphor a lot of favors. And rather than let the child struggle, the father steps aside. The shadow is gone, and finally the two stand side by side in the light. 9 symbolizes the end of their tumultuous relationship, with the father choosing to accept that their child was now an adult in their own right. The liberation of expectations being removed, and the admittance of mistakes having been made, the two can now support one another, communicate with one another, and express the love they share. Then something happens in Dragon Quest X. I don't know what happens. I haven't played it, but something does, I guess. Dragon Quest has always been about family. But this entire series, all of its wisdoms, all of its lessons, all the takeaways I've ever pulled from it, it's not just made up stories. This is a life told through the ages. And Dragon Quest XI marks that final baton pass between two people as they look back on their history together. They ask, what do we do with our mistakes? With the regrets we carry with us, with the things that have happened and wish we could take back? How do we stop the past from controlling the way we think about the future? What do we do now? You accept it. Here's a big old disclaimer. Spoilers related specifically to Sylvando ahead, and most importantly, I am not well versed in what proper representation of LGBTQ+ people in media looks like, but Sylvando's sexuality and gender expression are important to his character arc, which is important to what 11 is trying to get at. I'm going to do my best, but if what I portray as solid representation turns out to not be the case, please tell me. It's important to me that I'm corrected when I'm wrong about something, and if you correct me, other people will be able to see that correction too. It takes a good amount of time before we learn more about Sylvando's past, but there are a few context clues sprinkled about here and there. He avoids the town of Puerto Valor like the plague and has a deep connection to the Knight's Pledge. Explore Puerto Valor enough and you learn that the town's leader, Don Rodrigo, is the Master Knight and trains squires from every other kingdom in knighthood. You also learn that Don Rodrigo had a son that left home for an unknown reason and never came back.
I knew from the second I walked into that tent that I'd found my calling. Getting up on that stage and making people happy, that was the life for me.
It's important to note that despite wanting to join the circus and become a performer, Silvando doesn't discard the training his father gave him. He applies that training to a form of expression that better suits him. But even with his success, Silvando is still afraid of confronting his father, and when circumstances mean having to ask for his help, he asks you to come with him to speak to Don Rodrigo once again.
Well, there's no good way of saying this. I'm petrified of seeing him. So you have to come with me. You will, won't you, darling? Oh, thank you. I knew you'd say yes.
But when they meet, their exchange isn't marked by tension or anger. Silvando's father asks him whether or not he's accomplished what he promised.
Sorry? What are you apologizing for? Foolish boy.
Huh?
You have succeeded in making the world smile, see?
Don Rodrigo has come to understand his child and his mistake in reacting the way he did. Much like Silvando, this metaphor is subtle in the way Wolverine is not. When you think of the traditional knight, what comes to mind? Honor, nobility, chivalry. It's a structured and rigorous life. Silvando was raised as one. Talk like a knight, walk like a knight, act like a knight. His entire life, Silvando was raised to fit into a certain role.
Then one day, the circus came to town. It was so fabulous. I can't even describe it. It was love at first sight.
There's an old phrase that goes, "They ran away to join the circus." Usually this implies a form of escapism, but when viewed as the onlooker, from the perspective of the person joining the circus, the phrase gains a new connotation. It's about openness and celebration of who one is. In the circus, Silvando can be who he truly is and express himself in the way he chooses to, and in doing so bring happiness to himself and others. On the surface, knighthood brings with it this unwritten requirement of stoicism. Silvando disagrees. He believes that the principles of knighthood can be expressed in other ways, that people who believe in or enjoy the aspects of being a knight don't have to necessarily act in the traditional means a knight usually would.
But I wasn't going to let that stop me. Oh no. This was my calling. To make the whole world happy. I would be a knight in smiling armor.
They don't have to act like Hendrik, for example, who is by all means the poster child for what a knight is quote-unquote supposed to be. Figuratively, knighthood is masculinity, and within Eleven's context is attached to a certain way of expressing it. And Silvando challenges those ideas. Silvando expresses his masculinity without conforming to the gender roles that have been applied to it. In this cutscene, two things are made clear. Don Rodrigo still loves Silvando and accepts who Silvando is, and regardless of how Silvando chooses to express it, sees him as a knight.
Wait, Papi, did you say knight? You still think of me as one? You have no idea how... Oh, thank you, Papi. Thank you.
We never see the argument that led to Silvando leaving. We don't have to. We've played through a series that captures Silvando and Don Rodrigo's relationship, and we are now seeing the next step in it. The effort to understand and empathize with what our loved ones go through. The resolve to stand up to someone with the hopes of reconciling, but ready to face ever more adversity. These two are the best example of Dragon Quest XI's message, but we see similarities in the Sultan of Gallopolis and Prince Faris. When Faris comes clean about his schemes, the Sultan forgives him and blames himself for placing undue pressures on him.
Faris, look at me. The burden that was placed upon you, it was more than any boy could be expected to bear. It is I who must apologize, not you. But rest assured that I have learned my lesson. I will not make the same mistake again.
When Eric confronts Dirk, they have a conversation and hash things out.
Then I used the cash to open up the shop here and poured all my profits into bribing the guards up at the castle so they'd let you escape.
Now that you mention it, I did think it was weird they never tossed my cell the whole time I was digging that hole.
Two emotions are felt throughout the entire narrative: compassion and forgiveness. Everything leads up to one important message.
Don't waste your time bearing grudges. Live life with love in your heart. Always saw me, right? Bye now.
The decisions you make, things out of your control, things you've done and said, you accept they can never be taken back. That no matter what, there's always going to be another moment in your life you wish you'd handled better. That had things been different, you might not have found the wonderful people in your life, or the resolve to embrace who you truly were, or have helped someone important to you discover that strength within themselves. You have to accept those things and face every new challenge head on. The past can inform you, but not dictate your future. And even if you could go back to do things differently, that too would be another irreversible decision with more consequences, sometimes worse consequences. There's no way of telling how changing the past can affect your future. Either way, you have to live with the what-ifs and what would-have-beens, with hope that things will turn out all right and the compassion to bring that hope to those around you. With the responsibility of being in the present, the past being a distant memory, and the future just out of reach. From the day we are born to the day we die, we all live within the echoes of an elusive age. Nailed it! That's why I'm the best. Really, Dragon Quest XI is essentially a culmination of 30 years of the franchise, so various generations really came together to wholeheartedly put all their heart and soul into this work to bring it to life. That is evident throughout. The opening shot, the little symbols and subtle plot elements, the return of some of the best mechanics and features all polished up and tweaked to work together. It's like playing Dragon Quest's greatest hits, except a lot of it is still brand new and built with love and care. This mixture of new and old coming together to create a wonderful beginning that honors decades of work done by all kinds of people is a landmark. Dragon Quest XI being this combination of peaceful conclusion and powerful new starting point doesn't just make it an entry in Dragon Quest, it is Dragon Quest. It is everything this series stands for. It's my new favorite Dragon Quest. If you're going to play one, play this one. And all of that is Dragon Quest. There's a line from Uchikawa about his favorite part of modern game development. Part of it goes, aside from surprising people, I want to focus on the ways we connect people together through games. It's not in exactly the way he's probably envisioned it, but this series changed my life when I was growing up, and again after playing through all of it for these retrospectives. It began as an experiment to see if I could do it, and even though I kind of knew it'd gain traction over time, not a single bone in my body expected the size of the response it got, not one cell in my brain thought I'd improve so much as a creator because of it, or that I'd meet so many different, wonderful people and experience things I only ever joked about being a part of. I've gone on cross-country road trips to conventions with people I used to stare at from afar and tell myself not to entertain the idea of meeting. I've been lucky to call them my friends, and even luckier to have their respect. I find myself at the center of a community full of wonderful, unique people who share a common interest in the things I love. I've made friends that I don't think I'll ever forget or want to lose anytime soon. There isn't a day I don't wake up to more comments and messages from all of you, eager to share with me your stories about Dragon Quest and how much you like one particular entry. Some of you have even started playing the series because of my videos. I even like the comments telling me how wrong I am about Dragon Quest VI. Oh, those are my favorites. Some of you have colorful ways of expressing disagreement. And even still, I get comments about making someone's day a little better or how a father and his son watch these retrospectives together. I wanted to find myself and leave a mark, however small, in a space I grew fond of, and you helped me do both those things. Thank you. Thank you for validating me. Thank you for being here and for continuing to be here. I'd be a worse person without you. Oh, I told myself I wasn't gonna cry. Until we can get our hands on a copy of 10 that's in English and lets me play the online content without being banned from the servers, it's time to put Dragon Quest on the shelf. We might dust it off once in a while to take a look at some of those spin-offs. I'd love to cover Dragon Quest Monsters at some point, but I don't necessarily want to be the Dragon Quest guy. Now that we're done with the main line, I think it's time to look at another series. In fact,
I've already started.